When I was younger, I lived in a small, isolated town that felt like a fairy tale, idyllic, charming, but ultimately stifling. Everyone knew everyone else's business. My parents owned the corner bakery, a quaint little place that smelled of fresh bread and pastries, and I grew up surrounded by those warm scents, kneading dough at my mother's side. Yet, in the midst of that comfort, there was always a shadow lurking in the background. Not an actual shadow, mind you, but the kind that lives in your mind. At 14, my world shattered. My older sister, Lily, was everything I wasn't: brave, adventurous, and beloved. She was adored in our town for her stunning voice. She was always on stage, singing at school events and local festivals, destined for something greater. One evening, a tragic car accident took her from us. I remember the way the sky turned a bruised purple that night, just before the news broke. My world flipped upside down. I lost not just my sister but every ounce of joy in my life. Everyone walked around my house in solemn silence, whispering about the tragedy that had befallen us, and I felt like I was trapped in a web of grief. Days blurred into weeks, and the little pieces of cheer that had once filled our bakery crumbled into sadness. I started living only for the days when I could close my eyes and dream of days gone by, when laughter echoed through our home, instead of just empty silence. I sought solace in deep memories, holding on fiercely to Lily's old belongings, her albums, her clothes still hung in the closet, the last voicemail she left saved on my phone. Looking back now, it wasn't healthy, it was suffocating. I slipped into an almost insurmountable depression, refusing to let anyone see the depth of my grief. I pushed away my friends, becoming a ghost wandering the halls of high school, haunted by memories of a sister I could never bring back. But then, it happened, the moment that shifted everything. I was alone at home one night, the quiet pressing down on me like a weight. I'd just finished preparing orders for the bakery, a chore I'd taken over since the accident, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I decided to sort through some of Lily's things. Her bedroom had remained untouched, almost like a shrine, and as I opened her closet, a wave of nostalgia rushed over me. I found her old notebook tucked away in a dark corner, pages yellowed but bursting with beautiful handwriting. It was filled with song lyrics, poems, and dreams she'd envisioned, the tales she wanted to tell, the adventures she yearned to embark upon. As I flipped through the pages, a sense of anger welled up within me. Why had she been taken? Why didn't I deserve those dreams? I slammed the notebook shut and threw it across the room, sobbing uncontrollably. In that moment, something snapped within me, an unfamiliar rage directed at my own inaction, my own cowardice at letting the past dictate my future. Later that night, while still swirling in tears, something peculiar happened. I heard a whisper, soft and soothing, almost like a breeze grazing my ear. It was then that I realized something pivotal: I couldn't continue like this. I had to let go. Lily wouldn't want me to be consumed by sorrow. Holding my breath, I picked up the notebook again, tears still stinging my eyes but now more contemplative. I opened it once more, and the rage transformed into something profound, something almost cleansing. For the rest of the night, I pored over those pages, imagining I was hearing Lily's voice, urging me to live, to write my own story. After a few days, I began to try and replicate those lyrics, to put my grief into song. It was a catharsis I never expected. Awkward at first, every line felt heavy, an anchor binding me to my despair. But slowly, with each syllable, I began to weave a tapestry of not just loss but love. I could hear Lily in my head, encouraging me, pushing me to take that leap. I took her old guitar, dusty and neglected, and plucked the strings cautiously, letting melodies flit through the air like butterflies. Days turned into weeks, and before I knew it, I was spilling everything into my own notebook. I started performing my songs in secret, at open mic nights on the outskirts of town, cloaked in anonymity. As I drew acclaim from strangers, I felt Lily's spirit wrapped around me, a warm embrace nudging me forward. Through this journey, I realized I needed to transcend my grief, not by forgetting Lily but by honoring her memory. Eventually, after countless nights of practice, I took to the local stage of a small local coffee shop, a venue renowned for showcasing raw talent. Nervous energy coursed through my veins, but as I strummed the first chord, courage enveloped me. I channeled my heartbreak, my loss, and engineered it into beautiful songs, a tribute to my sister. The applause that erupted afterward was intoxicating. It felt like a warm hug, but more importantly, I could feel the ghost of my past fading away, as if Lily was standing there proudly, smiling down at me. With each performance, I began to shed layers of grief, learning the beauty of letting go. Instead of dwelling in silent shadows, I was finally basking in the light of my memories, writing new ones, still intertwined with Lily. It's been years since that pivotal night, but the revelation remains fresh in my mind. I learned that the past shapes us, but it doesn't define us. We can create new meaning from sorrow, breathe life into faded dreams, and through everything, emerge stronger. The day I let go of the past was not about erasing Lily from my heart but embracing her spirit in everything I do. In that, I found freedom. Life continues, unpredictable yet beautiful, filled with the weight of memories, but now, I carry them lightly, like a feather on the wind. I never believed in life coaches. For me, they were just glorified motivational speakers, people who preyed on your vulnerabilities and sold hollow promises wrapped in shiny self-help packages. I used to scoff at those who paid hundreds for advice about self-discovery, but that all changed one fateful evening in mid-January. It was one of those bleak, cold nights when the world feels heavy. I was stuck in a rut, drowning in a sea of regrets and uncertainties about my life choices. I had just come from a failed job interview, another blow to my dwindling self-esteem. Defeated, I took a walk to clear my head, but instead, I found myself wandering into a cafe I had never seen before. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and there were a few people scattered around, some tapping away on their laptops and others lost in conversation. An odd sign on the wall caught my eye, "Tonight's special, a free life coaching session." I chuckled to myself, contemplating the absurdity of it all. But I was curious, what could a stranger possibly tell me that I didn't already know? Yet, out of sheer boredom and desperation, I decided to stay. Soon enough, a woman named Clara entered, radiating an unsettling mix of energy and calm. She was dressed in vibrant colors, with an aura that suggested she had plucked it straight from a better world. Clara stood in front of us, exuding confidence, her easy smile breaking the ice. Without any introduction, she launched into her spiel about the power of perspective, of embracing the unknown, and stepping out of our comfort zones. I felt my skepticism creeping back in, but then she looked at me directly. "You, my friend, seem like you're carrying a heavy weight," she said, and I felt an involuntary shiver. Even in a room full of strangers, she made it seem like I was the only one who mattered. Clara began asking questions, probing my mind like a skilled surgeon. Without even realizing it, I was sharing parts of my life I had tucked away, my fear of failure, my past relationships that ended in heartache, my dreams that seemed to drift further away with each passing year. It felt surreal, therapeutic even. By the end of the session, I found myself captivated, a complete shift occurring in my perspective. She talked about the concept of the invisible wall we build around ourselves, how it blocks us from the opportunities life throws our way. It was as if she was staring deep into my soul, unveiling every hidden insecurity I had buried over the years. The session wrapped up with a challenge. Clara invited each of us to do one thing that terrified us, to share it online in a week, thereby holding ourselves accountable. I chuckled slightly at the thought of sharing my personal struggles on social media, but oddly, I found the idea liberating. I left the cafe feeling strangely high, illuminated by a flicker of hope. Over the next few days, I contemplated what I could do, not to just follow through but to genuinely push myself. A week later, standing in front of my computer, I finally decided. I posted a video of myself singing, a hobby I'd abandoned after a cruel critique from a peer years ago. My throat felt dry with anxiety as I pressed post, but to my surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Encouraged, I began taking small steps towards the life I had been too afraid to pursue. I took an improv class, started painting again, and even signed up for the local community theater auditions. Each action felt like peeling back layers that saturated me with a mixture of doubt and fear. Days turned into weeks, and my social media feed started to transform into a tapestry of my creative endeavors. But it didn't stop there. I felt drawn to Clara, her wisdom beckoning me back for more. I started attending her workshops regularly, where I met others looking to change their lives, all guided under her light. It was intoxicating. But then, that light began to dim. One evening, I arrived at a session only to find the cafe closed, an ominous "for lease" sign hanging on the door. Confused, I checked my phone for any updates but found nothing. It was as if Clara had vanished into thin air. Not one to give up so easily, I searched for her online. I dead-ended on forum after forum until finally, I discovered a thread discussing her in a negative light. Apparently, Clara had a history of things far worse than opportunistic motivations. There were whispers of manipulations, of people who had followed her advice blindly only to end up worse off than before. My heart raced. Had I been one of her targets? Had I really let my walls down, only to build them back up stronger than before? I sought out others from her sessions, hoping to find camaraderie, but they had mostly moved on, some dismissing my concerns as paranoia. I became obsessed, diving deeper into her past, uncovering stories of people who felt duped, betrayed. My newfound perspective seemed tainted, and I feared I had merely replaced the old trauma with a new one. What if every success I experienced was built on false foundations? What if Clara had a more sinister purpose beyond helping us? My nights grew restless, filled with visions of her. I began to notice the energies of those around me, the way they carried their burdens, the masks they wore. That spark of hope she initialized began to morph into a shadow that consumed me, leaving me to wonder if I had replaced one form of darkness with another. The night of the final straw arrived when I received a direct message from Clara. It was jarring, an invitation to meet at a secluded park, an old haunt of hers. In her elegant script, she promised clarity, urging me to trust her just one more time. Approaching the park that night, the fog hung low, shrouding everything in an eerie stillness. A sense of unease crept over me. I hesitated. My instincts screamed to turn back, but I was drawn to the possibility of resolution, of reclaiming the hope she'd initially sparked. Instead, I stumbled across something I never expected, a poorly concealed dark side, evidence of a life she had woven around suffering, almost as if she thrived on the emotional upheaval she spiraled us all into. As I stood there, hidden behind the twisted branches, clarity washed over me, and in that moment, I understood my journey wasn't about finding strength through her aid but carving my path amidst the debris. I walked home, leaving behind the allure of a false savior. I had encountered a life coach, yes, but more profoundly, I had encountered myself. I realized I didn't need anyone else to dictate my worth. I am the author of my narrative. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. I was free. It started as a typical Friday night, the air thick with all the excitement that comes with the weekend ahead. I was at Jamie's house with a few friends, laughing, joking, and pretending that real life didn't exist outside his basement. We had a couple of bottles of cheap beer, a game of truth or dare that quickly spiraled into chaos, and the sort of camaraderie that only comes with youth. Somewhere in the haze of laughter and bravado, I dared Luke to steal something from the corner store down the road. It seemed harmless at the time, another silly intoxicated challenge among friends. To my surprise, Luke, always one to rise to a challenge, stumbled out of the basement, beer in hand and a wild gleam in his eye. We all sat in anticipation, waiting for him to either return with something ridiculous or, heaven forbid, get caught. The minutes felt eternal, our whispers growing more anxious. But then, in what felt like no time at all, Luke burst through the door, panting, his face a mix of triumph and sheer panic. He held up a candy bar and some ridiculous novelty item, like a rubber chicken or something even more absurd. We erupted into laughter, but that's when the night took a turn. Unbeknownst to us, as Luke had raced away from the store with his ill-gotten gains, a figure had been watching from the shadows, a figure that would soon alter our lives forever. An older man, at least in his late 50s, stepped into the light of Jamie's porch lamp, face twisted into anger and disbelief. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes shone with a sharp glint of something I couldn't place. "You think this is funny?" he barked, startling the life out of us as we realized he wasn't just some random passerby, he was the store owner. My heart sank when he glanced at me, my mind racing back to the dare. I felt my cheeks heat with guilt because it had been my idea. The laughter died abruptly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the man's harsh breathing. "You need to teach your friend a lesson," he said, nostrils flaring as his glare leveled on me now. I wanted to protest, to argue that it was just a prank, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. "I'm going to give you a chance to fix this," he continued, and I could barely breathe. He demanded I accompany him back to the convenience store, where I would return the candy bar and offer an apology. The entire way there, anxiety gripped my insides like an iron claw. I replayed the evening in my head, realizing that if I'd never dared Luke, none of this would happen. I mentally kicked myself for being such an idiot, for not thinking of the potential consequences of my actions. As we walked through the neon lights toward the store, the man remained silent, and the weight of my guilt felt suffocating. Once there, he pushed me inside and told me to face the cashier. The woman behind the counter was in her late 20s, and she looked up, her expression marred by confusion as I stood there, the candy bar in hand. I'm sorry for what my friend did, I stammered out, practically choking on my words. It was just a stupid dare, and I didn't think it through. I didn't look at her but rather focused on the floor, hoping to vanish from existence. After several agonizing moments of silence, the woman sighed and placed her hands on the counter. You don't seem like a bad kid. This kind of thing happens all the time. I felt a flicker of relief, but the store owner, standing just behind me, coughed pointedly, and I knew I had to say more. I'll pay for it, I blurted out, feeling desperate to make this right. I reached into my pocket, dug out what little money I had, and handed it to her. I'll do community service if you want, I added hastily, somehow thinking that could also help alleviate my guilt. The owner's expression softened slightly, but still, he was far from forgiving. You don't just fix this with money or service. It's about understanding the impact of your actions. They can carry weight you don't yet understand. I think right then and there, as those words hung in the air, I realized he was right. My careless fun had the potential to cause real harm, perhaps even destroy lives in ways I couldn't see. It was a night filled with lessons I hoped I'd never forget. As we headed back to Jamie's, the atmosphere felt entirely different, electric with tension, shadows lingering where there once had been laughter. I had taken responsibility for my actions, and it had cost me far more than a candy bar. I didn't sleep much that night. The echo of the owner's words lingered in my mind, earning heavy weight as I replayed every moment that had led us to that basement, through the dares and laughter, and finally, this shocking encounter. I kept looking back, thinking about how a single dare had spiraled into something I never intended. The lesson stuck with me, shaping a turning point in my life. The next morning was cloudy, and I decided I would return to the store and speak to the owner again. As I walked to the convenience store, my stomach churned, half from the late-night beer I had consumed, half from the worry of facing him again. But I had to do it. I entered the store, and thankfully, it was quiet, no customers, just that familiar hum of the coolers. The owner was there, restocking shelves. He looked up and met my gaze. Back for more? He asked with an eyebrow raised, but there was also a hint of curiosity in his demeanor. I wanted to apologize again, I said, my voice steadier this time. I didn't take it seriously. I was being stupid, and I've come to understand that my actions can hurt others. He regarded me with a lingering scrutiny as if he was assessing the sincerity of my words. Do you truly understand what you've done? He inquired, and it felt like a test. I met his eyes. Yes. I'd like to help in any way I can. I want to make it right. A moment paused between us, heavy yet pregnant with purpose. Then, he sighed. All right. I'll let you help. You can come in after school and help me with stocking. And you need to think about why this matters going forward. I nodded, feeling lighter despite the weight of the responsibility ahead. As the weeks passed, I worked alongside him. The routine was simple, but the conversations we shared were profound. He shared stories of his own youth, careless decisions, and their consequences. I told him about friends who had made worse choices than mine, addiction, incarceration, lives ruined over a moment of poor judgment. In those moments, I learned about empathy, accountability, and the reality that everyone has a backstory, often filled with mistakes weighing heavy. The man taught me more than I could have imagined. He taught me about redemption. Each day felt like a step toward making amends, not just to him but rather to myself. I had taken responsibility for my actions, and in doing so, I had found a puzzle piece I didn't even know I was missing in my life. By the end of summer, that man had become a mentor to me, someone I admired for his strength and wisdom. I often think back to that fateful night. It was a lesson learned in the most unexpected way, a turning point that made me rethink my approach to every choice I would face in life. The connected threads of our stories entwined through a moment of carelessness, reminding me that every action has ripple effects. Now, every time I'm faced with a decision, big or small, I reflect, knowing full well the weight of responsibility is always within my grasp. It's the lesson that could have easily been lost had we just laughed it off. So, if you take anything away from this, let it be this: choices matter. Own up to them, because sometimes, a single dare can lead to an unforeseen journey, and it's up to you to make it a story worth sharing rather than one of regret. I never thought I'd be the person who would trade their sanity for the thrill of life. My name is Jake, and before this happened, I thought my life was pretty normal, just your run-of-the-mill anxiety and occasional bouts of sadness. I was in my late 20s, living in a small town, working a dead-end job, barely scraping by. But that all changed one fateful night. It started with a casual text from my childhood friend, Sarah. She wanted to catch up, and honestly, I hadn't spoken to her in years. We had been inseparable during our teenage years, always exploring the woods near our homes and losing ourselves in the vivid stories we created. I was a little apprehensive, unsure of how to approach the meeting given how much my life had changed. But I agreed, mostly out of nostalgia. Maybe we could reignite that spark of our youthful bond. When we finally met at a local cafe, I was surprised by how effortlessly we fell back into our rhythm. We laughed, reminiscing about the silly adventures we had shared, and it felt like no time had passed at all. But during our conversation, I noticed a flicker of concern in her eyes, a seriousness that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off at first, attributing it to my own anxieties about being too mundane in her presence. But as the evening progressed, she opened up about her own struggles, revealing that she had been battling severe depression for years, something I had no idea about. It was gut-wrenching to hear, but even more shocking was when she told me she had seen a therapist, was taking medication, and was trying every method possible to stay afloat. That night, approached a little differently. Her vulnerability cracked open something in me. Here was my best friend, someone I had always looked up to, and she was fighting a war within herself, a battle I had been too proud to acknowledge in my own life. After we parted ways, I found myself spiraling into a chaotic web of thoughts. I couldn't sleep, nor could I escape the uneasy feeling lodged in my gut. I began questioning everything about my own mental state. Was I truly fine? Could I even define what fine was anymore? Over the next few days, I replayed our conversation in my mind like a broken record, until it was all-consuming. I started isolating myself. My work suffered, I stopped responding to texts, even neglected simple tasks like cleaning my apartment and grocery shopping. I guess somewhere in my mind, I hoped that if I didn't pay attention to it, my mental state would somehow vanish back into the void from which it came. But one night, after another sleepless episode, I found myself pacing aimlessly in my dimly lit living room. Then I saw it, a faint glow emanating from my laptop, where I had left it open. A forum titled r/no sleep stared at me, filled with horror stories that seemed to thrive on the darkness of mental struggles. I scrolled through it absent-mindedly, devouring stories of people encountering their worst fears, agonizing journeys through madness, and bizarre realities that melted into nightmares. I was drawn in, completely engrossed by the idea of fear. Underneath my fascination, however, I felt something else, a dark sense of camaraderie with the writers. Their tales resonated with me. Part of me craved the thrill they wrote of, while another part was terrified of how closely it mirrored my own descent. In my fragile state, I decided to pen my own story, not entirely sure where it would take me or how deeply it would rip open my wounds. I wrote about shadows creeping into my mind, making me question every thought I had, every laugh I shared, how the simplest tasks turned into monumental challenges. In that moment of creation, I felt a rush of clarity mixed with dread. I kept writing until the early hours of the morning. As I hit the post button, I felt a sense of loss, as though I'd just unveiled my deepest, darkest fears to the world and left myself utterly exposed. The feedback poured in, some people sympathized, some empathized, but what struck me most was how many people shared similar experiences. Their comments felt like a lifeline, reminding me I wasn't alone in my struggles. But then, something weird happened. A user with the name Shadow Man began replying to my posts. At first, his comments were supportive, encouraging me to keep sharing my story, but as days turned into weeks, they took a sinister turn. He would message me late at night, in the guise of offering his help, but the messages became increasingly creepy. He would describe what he called the void, a dark space where one could lose themselves completely, embracing the chaos rather than battling it. I had already been on edge, and the obsession with the void soon began to blur the lines of my reality. Late at night, I could hear whispers echoing through my apartment, soft but insistent, resembling the tone of Shadow Man's words. "Just give in," they would say. "You're already halfway there." I started having nightmares laced with vivid imagery of me being lost in this abyss, dark, swirling shadows pulling me down into an incomprehensible darkness. During the day, I could barely function, consumed by fear, and at night, I'd be paralyzed by frightful dreams. I became a ghost of myself, going through the motions while wearing a mask of normalcy. My friends began to notice my absent presence, but I brushed off their concerns, hiding behind rational excuses. It was supposed to be a normal night when everything culminated into chaos. Drawn by one of the whispers, I felt an overwhelming urge to find out who this Shadow Man was. Was he real, or was he just a figment of my fractured mind? I delved deeper into the forum and discovered an obscure thread with eerie truths about a cult obsessed with tapping into the depths of mental agony. I realized that Shadow Man was not promoting healing, he was a harbinger of despair, luring others into the depths of what I now recognized as a dangerous spiraling descent. Terrified, I tried to disengage from the forum altogether, but the whispers told me something different. "You have to keep writing," they insisted. "It's the only way to escape." That night, I found the courage to confront my fears and face the truth about my mental health. I had to untangle the chaos before it consumed me completely. The next morning, I texted Sarah, asking her for guidance, admitting that I had spiraled down a dark path. She was shocked but incredibly supportive. We talked about therapy and the importance of speaking openly about our struggles. I was ready to acknowledge my battle with mental health, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity and hope. I didn't magically smile that day, nor did my fears vanish into thin air, but I realized that vulnerability was not weakness, it's what connects us, what binds us in our shared human experience. I learned that sometimes darkness can lead us to light, and sharing our personal stories can lift the burden of isolation, even in the most terrifying depths of despair. I left our/no sleep behind, not because I felt it was evil but because I recognized that I had to tether myself to reality and start focusing on healing. It's been months since my last dive into the terrifying abyss of online communities, and while I still struggle, I'm slowly rebuilding my life, brick by brick. I now walk past the cafe where Sarah and I first caught up, and instead of feeling haunted, I see it as a place of awakening. If you find yourself tangled in the shadows, know that reaching out, connecting with others, and embracing vulnerability could light the way back to peace. Mental health matters, acknowledge it, and don't hesitate to seek help. You are never truly alone, even in the darkest night. Trust me, I've learned the importance of not just surviving, but actually living. When I was a kid, the dark was something that haunted me like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I remember evenings spent lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while imagining monsters lurking just out of sight. My greatest fear was always the same. I was convinced something was watching me from the corners of my room, waiting for me to drift off to sleep. As I grew older, I learned to mask that fear, pretending it didn't bother me, but deep down, the darkness still held me captive with an iron grip. Fast forward to a month ago, when my friends dared me to spend a night alone in the old Johnson house, an abandoned building at the edge of town rumored to be haunted. I felt the sick knot of anxiety twist in my stomach as I accepted the challenge, trying to maintain a facade of bravery. The day of the dare, I arrived at the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that trembled under the fading light. The air was thick with the heavy scent of damp wood as I pushed open the creaky front door, each groan echoing like a warning in the hush of twilight. The atmosphere felt charged with something indescribable, both electrifying and terrifying. My heart pounded fiercely in my chest as I set up my flashlight and sleeping bag in the center of the dusty living room, an area strewn with rotting furniture and memories left to decay. I always believed that the creak of old wood was just a product of the house settling, but that night, every sound took on a life of its own. Time crawled as I sat there, listening to the whispers of the wind weaving through broken window frames, making me feel simultaneously relaxed and utterly on edge. As darkness enveloped the house, my flashlight began to flicker, the beam dancing erratically across the walls, revealing fading wallpaper and something else, shadows that seemed to flinch away from the light. I tried to tell myself that they were figments of my imagination, but the longer I stayed, the more real they became. Panic started to bubble beneath the surface, and then, without warning, my flashlight went out completely, plunging me into a suffocating darkness. My pulse raced, and I felt the icy tendrils of fear creeping up my spine, but something deep inside me stirred, a flicker of defiance that refused to let me succumb to my terror. I fumbled in my bag, desperately searching for my backup flashlight, but my hands trembled, and it felt like an eternity before I finally found it. I clicked it on, the beam steady this time, and immediately felt a sense of relief wash over me. But this comfort was short-lived because the beam revealed something I couldn't quite comprehend, an outline shifting in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. For a split second, I convinced myself it was just my overactive imagination, but the outline morphed into something distinctly humanoid. I fought the urge to scream, forcing myself to swallow down the rising bile in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, to flee to safety, but instead, I stood paralyzed, locked in a battle against my own fear. I shifted the light toward the figure, praying my eyes were deceiving me. As the light hit it, I gasped. There was nothing there, but my heart was racing, pounding against my ribs like a desperate prisoner. I convinced myself it was just a combination of shadows and the flickering light, a trick played by my own mind, and I took a few tentative steps closer, determined to face my fear head-on. That's when the whispers started. At first, they were barely audible, just the faintest sounds, but gradually they grew louder, rising into an unnatural chorus. My instincts screamed at me to run, but a stubborn part of me rooted me in place. It's just the wind, I repeated to myself. You can do this. Stealing my resolve, I called out into the darkness, "Who's there? Show yourself." The room fell silent, an eerie hush settling around me, and for a moment, I thought perhaps my fear was just an elaborate fiction I had spun. But then, as if answering my challenge, the temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in front of my face. The whispers returned, clearer now, no longer a mere murmur but an echoing cacophony. They spoke my name, repeated it like a mantra, and I felt my skin crawl. "Get out," they urged in hushed tones, which sent chills cascading down my spine. But oddly enough, instead of running away, a deep sense of intrigue washed over me. What was this place really? Driven by a combination of terror and adrenaline, I took another step towards the source of the whispers, the flashlight beam quivering in my grasp. I felt an odd compulsion, like the house was beckoning me closer. Just then, an overwhelming sense of despair washed over me, and I could feel the weight of countless souls pressing in around me. It was then that I understood, this place was filled with lost hopes and dreams, trapped in the darkness. In that moment, rather than feeling trapped, I felt a tremendous rush of empathy toward whatever lingered in those shadows. I raised my voice, this time with a sense of purpose. "You're not alone. I'm here. I'm listening." The whispers swelled suddenly, swirling around me like a gusting wind, their intensity rising, almost overwhelming. But just as quickly, they began to dissipate, barely hanging in the air like the last notes of a haunting melody. I stood there, heart racing, feeling more alive than I ever had. Finally, as the energy in the room shifted, I felt compelled to take control of my narrative. "I fear you," I admitted, "but I won't let you keep me from knowing this feeling." Silence fell, and I took a deep breath, no longer surrendering to panic but embracing the dark around me. I understood in that instant that fear is a two-edged sword. It can imprison us, but it can also free us if we learn to face it head-on. The feeling of dread and despair began to lift, replaced by an odd sense of freedom. That night in the Johnson house, I found courage where I least expected it, confronting my greatest fear in its lair. I made it through till dawn, and when the sun broke over the horizon, I emerged forever changed. The darkness still exists, but now I see it differently, not as a predator lurking in the corners, but as a canvas painted with possibilities, a space where understanding could bloom. It felt as if I had conquered not just my fear of the dark but something deeper within myself. That experience has stayed with me, and I often return to that house in my mind, reminding myself that bravery isn't the absence of fear but the will to embrace it, to transform fear into a source of strength. The bravest thing I ever did was learn how to find light in darkness and discover that sometimes the scariest places can lead us to the most extraordinary truths. I have been hesitant to share this story, but I think it's time. You'll probably think I'm overreacting or that it's just some creepy tale meant to scare people, but trust me when I say it's real, and it changed everything for me. It all started about 6 months ago when I moved into a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I loved how peaceful it was, away from the city chaos. The walls were a warm beige, and the view from the balcony was stunning, overlooking a park filled with towering trees. Things were perfect until my neighbor, Helen, decided to make her presence known. Helen was once a part of my daily routine. She seemed friendly enough at first, always waving when she saw me. But there was an intensity to her gaze that made me uncomfortable. At first, it was just little things. She'd ask about my day, offer me food, and would pop by uninvited, saying she thought she heard something in my apartment. I brushed it off, thinking she was just being neighborly. But then, the visits turned into long conversations that felt intrusive. I began to feel like I was living in a sitcom where the quirky neighbor troubled the main character's life. It was amusing at first until I realized I was losing my sense of privacy. I'd come home from work, and Helen would be waiting in the hallway, claiming she was just passing by. Despite the unease growing in my stomach, I didn't know how to set the boundaries I knew I needed. My attempts at subtlety failed. She'd talk over me and hijack my conversations. After a week of this, she began to show up at odd hours with food, insisting that I join her for a meal, or worse, she'd just walk into my apartment if I left the door half open. I thought about telling her off, but every time I tried to assert myself, she acted as if I were making up issues, emphasizing how we're neighbors and should care for one another. I ended up feeling guilty rather than empowered. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I stumbled into my apartment, exhausted. I locked the door, sighed, and sank onto my couch, hoping for some solace. But not even 10 minutes later, I heard a knock. It was late, and I was in no mood. I peered through the peephole, and there she was, standing outside with a plate of her homemade casserole and that wide smile on her face. I debated, and in a moment of weakness, I opened the door. The second I did, I felt a knot tighten in my gut. Before I knew it, I was trapped in my living room while she talked about nothing and everything, her eyes shining with an unsettling enthusiasm. The casserole hardly tasted better than cardboard, but I felt obligated to choke it down as she watched, her gaze scrutinizing my every bite. I knew I needed to end it. That night, I practiced what I would say to her, what boundaries I'd set, how I would assert my space. I felt empowered, like I was finally ready to reclaim my life. But she was a creature of habit, and the very next day, she showed up at my workplace. She walked straight up to my desk when I was with my boss and declared that I hadn't returned her casserole dish. I felt my face flush as everyone turned to look. My boss raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by this odd dynamic. I managed a weak smile, muttered something about needing to discuss it later, but she simply laughed it off. More humiliation ensued, and it started to spiral. I began to avoid calling my friends, worrying she'd somehow show up to invade our time together. I felt myself slipping, retreating further and further into solitude. My sanctuary felt like a prison, and my home had turned into a stage for a play I didn't want to star in. I won't sugarcoat it, I was terrified. I knew she was unhinged, but I didn't know how to get away from her grip. Then came the night that etched it all into my mind forever. It had been 3 weeks of this madness when I noticed something strange. Helen stopped coming over, stopped messaging. The absence was so sharp, I felt a strange sense of loss mingled with relief. Just when I thought things would settle, I discovered a letter slipped under my door. The paper was yellowed, creased, and unsealed. As I picked it up, a chill crawled down my spine. The letter was a confession, a disturbing tale of obsession. It detailed how she had watched my every movement, how she knew my routines better than I did myself. "You are mine," it said, "and I have been waiting for the right moment to bring us together." I dropped the letter as though it had burned my fingers and rushed to lock my door, my heart pounding like a drum in a symphony of terror. The paranoia swallowed me, taking root in my mind. What did she mean? Was she watching me right then? I found myself peering from the windows every time a shadow flickered in the hallway. Days later, I decided I could take no more. I made plans to move out. Even though I'd signed a lease, I needed to escape. But before I could pack my things, the apartment buzzed with an unnatural silence. I could feel it, the weight of being watched. While I frantically began to collect my belongings, the doorbell chimed again. I froze, knowing it had to be her. I crouched in the corner of my living room, waiting for the door to burst open, my heart pounding in my ears. In what felt like an eternity later, the echo of footsteps faded away. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon before bolting for the door. I heard whispers back in the hall, her voice sweet and dripping with malice. "You can't leave me, not now." I finally let my fear propel me. I fled, bag over my shoulder, heart racing as I sprinted to my car. All the lights felt like they were glaring, headlights blurring on the road. I hit the gas and didn't look back. But it didn't end there. Months have passed, and I think I've managed to start over. Yet, even now, in this new place, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting Helen to pop up in the alleyway or at the grocery store. I keep my doors locked and my curtains drawn tight. I share this story not for sympathy but as a warning. Please, learn from my mistakes. Establish your boundaries firmly and without hesitation. You never know who might be waiting to cross them, ready to invade the sacred space that should belong only to you. It's vital to defend your boundaries, for they are the walls that protect you from those who may never understand the word no. My story doesn't end here. It's a lesson wrapped in fear, echoing in my mind every single day. Respect your space, because there are people out there who think they know better. Boundaries are not walls, they are gates that keep out the chaos and the madness creeping ever closer. Do not let them in. I never thought trying a new sport would lead me down a path I never expected, a path filled with thrills and a chilling discovery that still haunts my dreams. It all started innocently enough. I was sitting at home, scrolling through social media on a lazy Saturday afternoon, when an ad popped up for a new sport that had just emerged in my town, something called extreme underwater hockey. Now, I'd played regular hockey as a kid, and I loved swimming, so the idea of the two combined was strangely appealing. With a few clicks, I signed up for the introductory class, excited but nervous, hoping not to embarrass myself in front of strangers. Little did I know, this decision would change everything. The first session was surreal, an unlikely gathering of people in a massive pool, all clad in goggles, snorkels, and flippers. The instructor, a boisterous man named Jack, had this glint in his eye, a passion for the sport that was contagious. He explained the rules, filled us in on the history of the sport, and then promptly shoved us into the water. The initial excitement turned into a rush of pure joy as I zoomed around in the water, swiping the puck with my stick, laughter bubbles bursting from my lips. I had never felt so alive. As the weeks progressed, I found myself drawn deeper into this bizarre community. The practices were intense, but every drop of sweat was worth it. I was making friends, feeling stronger, and discovering a thrill I had long forgotten. Everything seemed perfect until one fateful night when we scheduled a match against a more experienced team. I was nervous and exhilarated. Under the glow of the fluorescent lights and shadows dancing against the tiled walls, we dipped into the pool, ready to prove ourselves. But the game took a bizarre turn. When I surfaced for air, needing a breather, I noticed one of the opposing team players wasn't just playing. He was fixated, staring into the depths of the water as if he was communicating with something down below. My instincts kicked in, and I swam closer, peering into the blue abyss. "What are you looking at?" I shouted, though water muffled my voice. He didn't respond, he merely gestured for me to look down. I couldn't resist. The deeper I looked, the more I thought I saw shadows swimming far below us, something that didn't belong. I blinked rapidly, willing myself to adjust to the murky depths, but the shadows curved away, darting out of sight, leaving an unsettling feeling in my stomach. As the game continued, I couldn't shake off the incredible sense of dread. My teammates were focused on the puck, oblivious to the whispers of danger lurking below. I tried to shake it off, to enjoy the game, but even as we won, a disquiet pervaded my thoughts. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the haunting feeling. The thrill had dimmed, and every time I submerged my body into the water, I felt those shadows pull at my consciousness. I became obsessed, attending practices and watching every match, hoping that by facing this fear, it would dissolve. One night, after a long session, I decided to explore it myself. I gathered diving gear, grabbed my snorkel and fins, and slipped into the water when no one was around. The feeling of immersion washed over me, but this time, it didn't feel thrilling, it felt heavy with anticipation. I descended into the darkness, kicking my legs, forcing myself deeper until I felt the chill seep into my bones. I kept searching, the water around me becoming darker, the silhouettes swirling around me. Then, I saw it, a large, shimmering shape, a creature, something unnatural that glimmered ominously. My heart raced. This wasn't a fish, it was too large, too defined, with a body resembling nothing I had ever seen. I panicked, trying to swim back up, but it was as if the water had begun to resist my every move. The dark figure drew closer, a maw opening, filled with an abyss of sharp teeth that sent ice-cold terror through my body. Those shadows weren't just shadows, they were something alive, something hungry. With every ounce of strength, I kicked upward, crashing into the surface, gasping for air. I crawled out of the pool, drenched and trembling, certain I had narrowly escaped something malevolent. But my obsession with the sport didn't fade, it grew, replaced by a fearful reverence. I initiated conversations with teammates, each of them sharing their own odd experiences, visions of shadows beneath the surface, whispers of ancient creatures that were said to guard the depths. I began to realize that I wasn't the only one affected, everyone felt it, a lure calling them deeper into the water. But it didn't just lure us, it demanded a price. One by one, my teammates vanished, they didn't show up for practices, and when I reached out to them, no one would respond. The sport that once filled me with exhilaration now left an overwhelming void, tinged with loss. Then came the day of the championship. I didn't want to play, yet I felt I had to. There was an electric buzz in the air, a sinister undertone laced through the excitement. Our coach had warned us about the strange tendencies of competitors, the strange drawing power of the waters. When the final whistle blew, something within me snapped. The urge to dive down and face whatever it was grew so fierce that I couldn't hold back. I slipped beneath the surface, pulling through the water until I saw it again, the creature lurking, this time its eyes, full of knowledge and hunger. I watched in horror as my fellow players started to appear, pulled under the weight of that ominous call. They were enchanted and terrified, just as I had been, but it was too late. This was not merely a sport, this was a seduction, and I was afraid I was next. I felt my consciousness slipping as I began to swim towards it, entranced by the depths, the allure too strong to resist. But as I neared that maw of darkness, something inside me screamed to survive. A surge of adrenaline jolted me back. I flipped in the water and swam with everything I had toward the surface. Halfway up, I could feel the darkness pulling at my legs, but I fought harder, bursting from the water like a cork, gasping for breath. My teammates hesitated, trapped between two worlds. I scrambled out, screaming for them, but they were lost. The pool became a waiting trap for all who dared to look deeper. Since that night, I haven't returned to the sport, yet I find remnants of it everywhere, shadows in my peripheral vision whenever I go near water, whispers in my dreams, and the longing to dive deeper, to face what lurks beneath the surface, though I know it's a path I can never take again. The time I tried a new sport and fell in love with it was the moment I turned my back on a beauty that was anything but innocent, and now its memory haunts me, an echo of choices made in the excitement of swimming with shadows. Even as I write this, I live in fear of the water, of what happened to my friends, and what the sport cost each of us. Whatever you do, don't let curiosity lead you into the depths, for not all passions are pure, and some discoveries may lead you to a darkness you can never escape. I was an ordinary guy with a routine that spiraled into chaos. My friends always joked about how I had no concept of time management. I'd start a project, get distracted, and then panic the night before it was due, pulling all-nighters fueled by energy drinks. If I had a dime for every time I dreaded the school day that followed the midnight sprint, I would have a hefty bank account. But then everything changed one fateful morning. It started when I stumbled across an obscure website that boasted about a secret to time management. It promised crazy results, saying if you followed their method, you would gain control over every minute of your life. Intrigued and desperate for change, I dove deep into their rabbit hole. The site had a series of seemingly high-tech techniques. One approach that caught my attention was called the zero-point system. It claimed to harness the subconscious mind to bend time. Odd, right? But I was willing to try anything. I printed off the guidelines and began to implement them with religious zeal. The first step was as simple as it was bizarre: set an alarm clock for bizarre hours throughout the night. 3 a.m., 5 a.m., 7 a.m., you name it. I'd wake up, sit in the dark, and meditate for a few minutes about killing procrastination. Everything about this felt strange, and I wasn't sure it was working. But then, 2 weeks in, my grades started to improve. I finished assignments ahead of time, felt like I had more energy, and time seemed to extend around me. I was elated. I began to think of myself as a time management guru. My friends noticed I was less stressed, and my teachers praised my newfound diligence. It seemed silly how much progress I was making, but I didn't stop there. I decided to push the limits of the system. Over the next few weeks, I adjusted my sleep and alarm settings to wake up at the oddest hours constantly. I didn't want to miss a moment. Surprisingly, my social life took a hit. I was too focused on conquering my time to meet up with friends. The isolation started to gnaw at me, but I shrugged it off. I just wanted my life to run smoothly. Then, I began to notice something off. Sometimes when I woke up during the night, shadows flickered against the walls, almost as if they were alive. I initially brushed it off as fatigue-induced hallucinations. But the more alarms I set, the more pronounced those shadows became. I even considered abandoning the entire zero-point system, but my evolving obsession drowned out that hesitancy. I wanted to believe I was on the path to mastery, so I dove deeper into the routine. One morning, as my alarm blared at 3 a.m., I sat, eyes closed, focusing on procrastination. It felt different that night. I opened my eyes, and the room seemed darker, almost suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a figure lurking in the corner, a shapeless mass that absorbed the light around it. Panic overtook me, and I fumbled to turn on the light, and just like that, it was gone. I shook it off, blaming sleep deprivation. The weeks wore on, the figures returned each time I woke in the wee hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were growing more defined, more aggressive, like they'd started to feed off my energy rather than merely observe. I grew increasingly strained. My friends, once understanding, began to voice their concerns over my absence. I promised them I'd make it up to them once I had my life under control. I was convinced that with just a bit more time management, I could balance my academics and social life again. But the shadows seemed to mock me. They followed me, whispering all the things I feared, that I was destined to be alone, that my newfound success was illusory, all while the alarms ticked closer to midnight, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. Before I knew it, I was at a crossroads. I had the success I'd dreamed of, but the price was high. I decided to attend a party on the night I usually told myself to stay up on time. I thought it would be good to have some normalcy, one last hurrah before diving back into the fray. That night, instead of the dark shadows, I found genuine laughter and connection. I let myself breathe again. But just as my heart felt at home, the alcohol blurred the edges, and the familiar chimes of my alarm crept into my mind, demanding attention. I pushed my phone away, hoping that perhaps for just one night, I could forget about the zero-point system. In doing so, I went to sleep that night with lights still on, falling into a slumber that I hadn't truly indulged in weeks. I awoke, disoriented, to the sound of hushed whispers rather than alarms. The shadows were there again, and this time they were furious. They surrounded my bed, an army of darkness bearing down. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air turned ice cold, and I felt them pulling at my soul, an attempt to drag me back into their black hole of despair. In that moment, I understood, it wasn't my time management I was failing at, it was being controlled by the promises of the void. With an uncommon surge of strength, I broke free from the grip of paralysis and jumped from the bed, screaming at the figures to leave me alone. To my shock, as I yelled at the darkness, it began to recede, flickering back into nothingness. But the moment brought its own realization. The anxiety, the compulsion to manage every second, had drawn this curse to me all along. I learned that real-time management wasn't about squeezing every second into productivity but rather finding the balance between commitments and personal connections. I had to reclaim my life from those shadows. The days that followed were a struggle, full of late-night confessions with friends and rebuilding connections, but slowly I found success in life again, one imperfect moment at a time. I buried the zero-point system, letting its vague promises fade into my past. I learned to embrace the chaos, understanding that time, in its infinite flow, would always be challenging. Sure, some shadows lingered, singing their siren songs, but now they were just echoes. I'm not saying I conquered time management, I still have my struggles. But I learned to separate productivity from my soul, and in doing so, I reclaimed the joy of living, free from the chains that once bound me. I've always been a creature of habit. My life was a monotonous loop of wake, work, eat, sleep. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but one day, I stumbled across a post online about the benefits of morning rituals. Curiosity piqued. I thought, what the hell? And committed to changing my morning routine. The first morning was rough. I woke up an hour earlier, groggy as hell, and stumbled into the kitchen to make some herbal tea instead of my usual coffee. Standing there, sipping on that strange, warm liquid, I felt both lost and strangely liberated. I began to meditate, at least, I attempted to. The first few minutes were filled with my racing thoughts about work and bills, but I persisted, convinced that this was going to be the thing that changed my life. Little did I know, I was stepping into the unknown. After a week of this new routine, something eerie began to happen. I started having dreams, not just any dreams, but vivid, lucid ones. Each night felt like I was drifting into a new layer of reality. I dreamt about a woman behind a red door, beckoning me to come closer. There was something about her. The dreams felt so real that I would wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of her gaze still pressing down on me. The more I committed to my changes, the more pronounced the dreams became. After a few weeks, I recognized that the dreams were connected to my routine. And then came that night, a dream unlike any other. In the dim light of the room, I entered through the red door, finding myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with portraits. Each painting seemed to depict a different version of me, living out alternate realities, lives I could have lived had I made different choices. It was both fascinating and terrifying. I walked down the hallway, looking at each picture, noticing their details, the success, the heartbreak, the victories that could have been. Just as I was absorbing it all, I noticed a flicker at the end of the hall. There she was, the woman from my dreams, standing at the end, longing for me to come closer. My heart raced. Before I could think, I found myself sprinting towards her, and just when I thought I'd reach her, the world around me began to dissolve into a hazy fog. I awoke with a start, my room was dark, and the only light came from the window. I felt an impulse, unlike anything I had ever experienced, compelling me to make a change right then and there. Exhausted but driven, I decided to go for a late-night walk, something I had never done. The streets were deserted, a cold breeze nipped at my skin as I wandered aimlessly. In my head, I replayed that dream, the portraits, the gazes, and most importantly, her. Suddenly, I found myself at the park, a quiet, sprawling place surrounded by trees that spread like festering shadows in the moonlight. Something urged me to the old swing set that creaked faintly with each breeze. I sat down, gripping the cold chains, feeling oddly comfortable. That's when I noticed a figure at the other end of the empty park, a woman standing beneath a flickering street lamp. My heart lurched painfully in my chest. Had she somehow followed me from the dream? It felt impossible, ludicrous even, but the resemblance was uncanny. The same long hair, the same piercing eyes. My instincts screamed to run, to hide, but I was rooted to the swing. She raised her arm slowly, pointing directly at me. The air thickened with an unspeakable tension. I reluctantly stood up, slowly approaching her, my mind racing, wondering if I was entering an entirely new reality. The closer I got, the clearer her features became, and then the world began to spiral. It was as if reality itself was reshaping around me. I staggered as colors swirled, the whole scenery morphed into a kaleidoscopic mess. I heard a voice, smooth but haunting, whispering my name, "You can be more than you are." The voice filled my head, echoing within the abyss of my mind, drowning out my thoughts. And then, I was in front of her, standing inches away, something radiated between us. "You've seen what could be," she said softly. My heart pounded as I stood paralyzed, the world a blur around us. "I can show you another path, a way to escape the cycle you're trapped in." A part of me wanted to reject her offer. What did it mean? Would I lose everything I had achieved, throw away my life for the unknown? But another part of me was willing, desperate for a change. My routine had been my prison, hasn't it? "Yes," I said, almost strangled by my own words. Suddenly, the ground shook, a low rumble that unnerved me. I felt the air crackle with energy as visions whipped around us, flashes of lives I hadn't lived, success, fame, heartbreak, love, the pain and joy of it all, playing out in an endless montage like a movie burned into the fabric of reality. It felt intoxicating. I could feel myself unraveling, pieces of me scattering into the infinite possibilities before me. Everything blurred, and in an instant, I was swept away, leaving fragments of my old self behind, welcoming the unknown with open arms. I awoke the next morning in my own bed, drenched in sweat, a pounding in my head. Nothing seemed different at first, just my familiar surroundings. Then I glanced at my clock and shot upright, time felt strange, unsteady. I rushed to the window, looking outside as if expecting to see something different. My heart raced as I caught sight of the street below. Colors appeared more vibrant, there was an energy in the air. I stepped outside, the world felt lighter. I engaged with every passerby, every interaction ignited something within me. I wasn't just living, I was thriving. But then, the eerie feeling of being watched crept back. In the corner of my mind, a voice echoed, "You can change it all, just like that." Time seemed fluid, and suddenly, I grasped that the changes I had made weren't just a routing improvement, they were the beginning of a new narrative, a timeline that rippled with endless possibilities. For weeks, I embraced this newfound energy, stepping into opportunities, embracing risks, and connecting with people I would have previously shied away from. But there was a price, wasn't there? I began to notice subtle shifts, the shadows lengthening, a pervasive sense of anxiety creeping back in, memories resurfacing like ghosts. I realized that in pursuing alternate realities, I had inadvertently fractured my own. Each choice left behind a piece of me, and slowly, night terrors returned, revisiting vivid dreams where that red door remained ajar. I could feel the woman's presence every night, drawing me back towards her, taunting me with possibilities I had yet to experience but had once forsaken. The thrill of the change began to weigh heavily. One night, I found myself at that park again, standing at the same swing set, feeling her gaze from the shadows. "You chose," she whispered, the sound threading through my mind like poison. "But did you choose wisely?" I felt her presence closing in, the fragmented pieces of my former self circling like vultures. "You will pay for every decision, every moment." Just then, the shadows deepened, and I felt like I was back at the precipice of that red door, now more menacing than ever. I could either wade deeper into this altered reality or find a way to reclaim what was mine. Realizing that I couldn't escape the consequences of my choices, I understood then that life is a delicate balance, and for every change made, there is a cost, a threaded path that entwines every facet of existence into an intricate weave of light and darkness. The morning routine that once helped me escape stagnation now felt like an inescapable labyrinth. After that night, I altered my approach. Instead of running towards the changes, I began to embrace them gradually, careful not to lose myself in the process. I focused on grounding myself, on cherishing the present and the relationships I had nurtured. Eventually, the dreams receded, and though the woman remained a part of my memory, I realized she was not a specter of regret to haunt me but a reflection of potential, an echo of every choice I could make. With every dawn that broke, I learned acceptance rather than racing towards what could have been. So, as I sit here telling you this tale, I hope you see that the tale of change is not one of simple choices but a dance, a tightrope of fate where every step you take creates ripples in the tapestry of your life. Be careful how you tread, for every routine is a doorway, each decision a threshold to an uncertain realm, making sure you don't lose yourself in the echoes of what could have been. I survived the journey, only to realize change isn't an end, but a path, with every moment, every choice sculpting the life you mold. But beware, the more fervently you chase the unfamiliar, the more alluring and treacherous the echoes of your own psyche can become. When I first heard about the little food truck on the corner of Maple and Fifth, I didn't think much of it. Just another trendy spot hawking gourmet tacos and artisanal smoothies, right? I had been living in this city for years and had seen plenty of food trucks come and go. Yet, something tugged at my heart, a deep-seated curiosity that screamed at me to check it out. The thing was, I wasn't exactly the adventurous type when it came to food. My culinary repertoire consisted mainly of frozen pizzas and whatever I could whip up quickly in the microwave, but this felt different. The owner was this eccentric older woman with hair like cotton candy and a voice that could soothe a storm. Her name was Maribel, and she had this infectious energy, one that drew people in and kept them coming back for more. After chatting with her for a bit, she casually mentioned the dish I had never heard of, Rabas del Mar. She described it as a delicacy from her coastal hometown, a fusion of fried squid and spices, served with a twist of lime and a salsa unique to her family. I could feel an odd sense of anticipation growing within me, so I reluctantly ordered the dish. As I waited, she chatted with other customers, her laughter mingling with the sizzling sounds from her kitchen. The air smelled like a mix of the ocean and something spicy. It made my stomach growl louder than I ever thought possible. Finally, she handed me a paper plate, a little worn but loaded with a generous portion of vibrant, crispy squid. It looked intriguing, and before I even realized it, I was taking a huge bite. The moment the flavors exploded across my taste buds, I was hooked. It was unlike anything I had ever tasted, crunchy, tangy, and just the right amount of spicy. I could feel the euphoria radiating through me, and I remember the exact thought that struck me: this is my new favorite food. As I savored my last bite, I felt a strange heart-racing excitement. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a glow on the street that felt almost otherworldly. It was the kind of moment that would get a cheesy movie deal, and for a brief second, I thought my life was like some romantic comedy, where I'd discover a new passion. Little did I know, that passion would take a sinister turn. That night, I went home, reliving the flavors of the Rabas Del Mar in my mind, practically floating on the cloud of culinary bliss. I couldn't help but crave more. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself at Maribel's food truck almost obsessively. I watched as she prepared the dish, amazed by her skills and the way she made cooking look like an art. But then, something unexpected happened. Each time I devoured her dish, I started feeling different. At first, it was just a little enhanced energy, but soon it became something more. I felt more awake, more alive, like a thrill was coursing through my veins. It spiraled until my cravings grew insatiable. I could hardly focus at work, and most of my conversations involved how good that squid was. My friends started getting concerned. They even staged interventions, trying to convince me to give anything else a shot, but I brushed them off. They just didn't understand the magic I had discovered. Yet, as euphorically consumptive as this journey felt, it started to turn dark. One evening, I received a message from Maribel detailing a special event she was hosting, an exclusive tasting night. I felt a thrill ignite within me, but a vague dread crept in as I replied immediately, securing my spot. That night, I went back to the food truck, but it felt different this time. The air was thick, and the vibrant colors of the truck appeared dull under the night sky. Maribel greeted me with a mischievous smile, and I could see something was off. There were only a few of us there, what felt like a secret gathering among a handful of chosen ones. Once the others arrived, Maribel presented her special menu, all Rabas Del Mar, but she said she'd added an extra twist just for us dedicated fans. Upon first bite, I was in heaven again, until an unsettling warmth slowly made its way through my gut. It was profound, sickly sweet, and utterly nauseating. My fellow diners were groaning too, our eyes wide and wild as the flavors warped in our mouths. I felt a wave of paranoia wash over me as I watched Maribel. Her laughter didn't seem to carry the same warmth anymore, it felt sinister, almost manic. Suddenly, she leaned in for a whisper, her eyes glittering fiercely. "Tonight, you'll understand, where flavor meets fate." Those words echoed in my mind, shaking me to my core. The feeling in my stomach shifted, becoming a raw tension that flared up my throat. The world around me began turning into a blur, the laughter of the others mixing with the sound of my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I needed to get out. As I stumbled to my feet, I knocked my chair backward, the sound clanging in my ears like a wake-up call. A frantic energy surged through me, and I bolted toward the exit, the chilling realization creeping in that something was terribly wrong. Out of breath, gasping for sanity, I turned back to look at the food truck one last time. It appeared to pulsate, the colors warping unnaturally, and a feeling settled in my gut that I had sold my own soul for a dish. I ran, not stopping until I reached home, my heart racing and my mind reeling. The next day, I tried to shake off the experience, convincing myself it was just a strange night. I returned to the bustling streets of my city, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Days passed, and I tried to go back to my normal life, but I started seeing glimpses of Maribel everywhere, her cotton candy hair in my peripheral vision, her laugh echoing faintly through the subway. But that's when, inexplicably, I started feeling sick. The thrill I once lived off culminated into isolation as I lost my appetite for everything but her dish. I began searching for traces of her food truck, speaking to anyone I could find about the elusive memory of Rabas Del Mar. But everyone else had moved on, seemingly forgetting about it, while paranoia clawed at my insides. I began to think that perhaps Maribel was not just a talented chef, but something else entirely, perhaps a witch, or something darker. The cravings progressively morphed into a desperation, and soon, I was diving into the alleys and corner shops, asking everyone in my path if they had seen the food truck. But no one had. One night, I found myself lost in a haze of despair, wandering through streets that now felt like a labyrinth. I thought, just maybe, if I could track down that otherworldly blue light that had illuminated the truck, everything would return to normal. As I turned a corner, my heart skipped. There it was, the truck blanketed in shadows, the once vivid colors muted. My heart raced as I approached, filled with an equal mix of excitement and dread. But as I reached it, something was off once again. The window was boarded up, and I could hear the faint sound of laughter from inside, a noise that felt too sinister to place. With shaking hands, I knocked, desperate for the taste of freedom from my insatiable cravings. For a split second, the laughter stopped. No response. I banged harder, my heart thudding as I felt life strangled with longing. The door creaked open, and there stood Maribel, her face obscured in shadow. Her voice was light, yet brimming with darkness. "You wanted to taste the ocean, didn't you?" I backed away, heart pounding, but her eyes glimmered with something sinister, a promise of the night, satisfaction woven with despair. The last thing I remember was her laughter ringing through the air as the world faded and the vibrant colors ghosted out of my reality. I think they found me on the street days later, mumbling about the food and the darkness, but the truth lingers. The thrill of new food can sometimes come with an insatiable price, one that asks for more than just a taste. If you're tempted to wander into the unknown corners of culinary artistry, remember this: some flavors hide things you might not want to uncover, and sometimes, favorites should stay undiscovered. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, standing on the brink of despair, teetering on the line between victim and victor. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, and where individuality was often ridiculed. I was the quiet girl, the one who blended into the background. At school, I was called names: square, ghost, and worst of all, loser. The taunts started in middle school. At first, they were just childish jabs that rolled off my back, but as I entered high school, they morphed into something darker. A group of popular girls took a liking to me, not the kind of liking you'd hope for. They made it their daily ritual to torment me, just for their amusement. The leader, Tiffany, had a razor-sharp tongue and a penchant for cruelty. She'd send me messages in class, mock me in the cafeteria, and film my most embarrassing moments to replay later for the entire school. There were days I could barely muster the courage to leave the safety of my home, the thought of facing them gnawing at my insides. My parents were supportive, but they didn't quite understand. They told me to ignore them, that the pain would pass, but I felt trapped in a cycle of despair. That was until the night of the school talent show, a defining moment that would forever change me. I decided to enter the competition, thinking it'd be a way to get back at my bullies. Singing was one thing I was good at, it was my escape from this nightmare. But as the day approached, my nerves clawed at my confidence. Tiffany and her crew caught wind of my participation and took it as an opportunity. They plastered the school with snarky posters ridiculing my effort and even created a group chat to openly mock my singing skills. My heart sank, but a fire ignited within me. I realized that every cruel word they threw my way only made me more determined. The night of the talent show, I stepped onto that stage, utterly terrified but resolute. The auditorium was packed, the murmur of anticipation evident in the air. As I took my place in front of the microphone, I could see Tiffany seated with her friends, smirking, whispering snarky comments to each other. But something shifted inside me. The years of torment morphed into a strength I never knew I had. When the music began and I opened my mouth to sing, it wasn't just my voice that filled the room, it was my pain, my struggle, my defiance. With each note, I channeled my hurt, my fear, and my hopes into the performance. The audience was captivated, some even standing in awe, but I specifically locked eyes with Tiffany. The expression on her face was that of surprise, disbelief. I saw the smirk fade, replaced by a stunned silence. In that moment, I felt invincible. I was no longer a victim but a warrior of my own story. When I finished, the auditorium erupted in applause, and I stood there, breathing heavily, the kind of happiness that comes from claiming your power pulsing through me. I left the stage with a rush of adrenaline, the kind most people only experience once in a lifetime. But then came the aftermath. Tiffany, taken aback and furious, stalked up to me after the show, her voice dripping with venom. "Enjoy your moment, loser. You'll never be one of us," she hissed, but to my surprise, I no longer felt the sting of her words. I looked her straight in the eyes and replied, "I don't want to be a part of your world." With that, a crowd of students who had witnessed the performance began to gather. They were smiling, congratulating me, and I felt a swell of positivity. For the first time, I realized the power of standing up for yourself. The bullies who had once consumed my life lost the hold they had over me that night. My confidence began to grow like a wildfire. In time, I became friends with others who had once felt alone, misfits like me who had quietly struggled. Together, we formed bonds over shared experiences, and support turned into friendship. It wasn't just about singing, it was about lifting each other up. The cafeteria buzz of laughter no longer felt like jabbed knives but a comforting hum. Each kind word exchanged, each compliment received, was a patch in the quilt of my growing confidence. With every passing day, I realized I had the power to change the narrative. No longer would their words define me. I began to take on challenges I would have never dreamt of before. I engaged in discussions, debated in class, and even helped organize school events. I blossomed, and with every challenge conquered, the ghost of my past became less and less daunting. I learned that real confidence doesn't come from being accepted by others, but from standing firm in your own worth. Although Tiffany and her friends tried to maintain their hold, their power dwindled as they watched the tide turn. I wasn't the scared girl they could taunt anymore. I had become my own champion. Now, looking back, standing up for myself at that talent show marked the beginning of a journey, a metamorphosis from a victim to a survivor, a scared girl to a confident young woman. My story isn't just about standing strong against bullies, it's a message to others facing their struggles. It's about harnessing your pain, turning it into power, and realizing that you're not alone. So if you find yourself in a shadowy corner of despair, know that you have the strength within you to rise. You may be met with resistance, but your voice can echo louder than their laughter. Stand up, be heard, and claim your confidence. It can feel impossible at times, but I assure you, it's worth every moment of bravery you muster. Because in that moment of courage, you might just discover who you really are. I never thought I would be part of a story that would change the lives of two people forever. It was just an ordinary Friday night, the kind where my friends and I would gather in my basement, playing video games and sipping soda. Jay, my best friend since kindergarten, had been unusually quiet. He'd been distant for weeks, and our group had sensed something was off. We had tried to joke him back into his usual self, but every time we brought up how weird he was acting, he'd just give us a forced smile and change the subject. I remember sitting on my worn-out gaming chair, the glow of the TV casting strange shadows across my friends' faces. I glanced over at Jay, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with a can of soda. His eyes were trained on the screen, but they didn't seem to be focused on the game. My heart ached for him. I wish I knew what was going on in his mind. As the night wore on, the laughter and video game sounds echoed in the basement, but I felt a heavy silence enveloping Jay. It wasn't until near midnight that things took a dramatic turn. "Hey, guys," Jay said suddenly, his voice breaking the laughter like glass shattering. My stomach dropped. This was it. I could hear the nervousness in his voice, and I felt every set of eyes turn toward him. "I need to tell you something." I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat, and the room grew quiet. "I've been going through a lot lately," he continued, his words trembling in the air. "And I think it's time I stop hiding." Everyone sat still, tension building. I'm not sure if any of us truly knew what he was about to say. "I'm gay," Jay finally blurted out, and the words hung in the air as if time froze. I could see the conflict on his face, as though he was bracing for the blow of rejection. I held my breath, waiting for some kind of response. My heart raced when I noticed some of our other friends exchanging glances, their expressions unreadable. The silence stretched on, each passing second feeling like an eternity. Then, to my surprise, Kelly, one of our quieter friends, stood up. "Jay," she said softly, "I'm proud of you for saying that. It's not easy." Relief washed over me, and I could see Jay's shoulders relax a fraction. "We're still your friends," Mike chimed in, his voice cutting through the tension. "Nothing changes that." I felt a surge of hope at their responses, but in the back of my mind, dread lingered. Jay took a deep breath, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've been scared that you guys would hate me or think differently of me." "You're still you," I said, finding the courage to chime in. "We love you, man. It doesn't change anything for us." A wave of warmth flooded the basement, breaking the heaviness that had settled over us. Jay managed a smile, and our group erupted into a series of supportive affirmations. I was relieved but still terrified. Despite the support, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was just beginning. As the night wound down, we spent hours talking, reminiscing about old memories and sharing dreams for the future, and I could see the weight slowly lifting off Jay's shoulders. It felt like a turning point, for him and for us. We promised to keep his secret safe for as long as he needed and to be there for him in any way we could. But I couldn't help but wonder how my own feelings were shifting. I felt burdened by the weight of all this knowledge. I wanted to protect him, but I also felt this strange wave of pride, as if by standing up for him, I was coming to realize more about myself. I started to consider how society would react to Jay's new truth. Would his family accept him? Would we face backlash? But for the moment, in that basement with the flickering light and our laughter echoing off the walls, we were just friends, no labels, no fear. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself watching Jay closely. His demeanor brightened, and the carefree Jay I knew returned, albeit in fragments. He started experimenting with his style, wearing clothes that made him feel more authentic. It was exhilarating to watch, but another part of me began to panic. I was developing feelings I had never recognized before, feelings that went beyond friendship. Each time he laughed or flashed that radiant smile, I felt my heart do a somersault. How could I tell him? I remember pacing around my room one night, feeling defeated. I wanted to be open, to support him fully, but fear clung to me like a shadow. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if I jeopardized our friendship? The next week, Jay invited our group to go see a movie, and it just so happened to be the day he planned to come out to his parents. I offered to go with him, wanting to be there for support. His parents had always seemed open-minded, but I felt the tension in his voice when he asked, "Do you think they'll accept me?" He wondered, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've always said they would, but it's another thing to hear it, you know." I tried my best to reassure him. "You're brave, Jay. You'll handle this." He smiled at me, but I could see the fear lingering in his eyes. The night of the movie, he seemed distracted, lost in thought. As the credits rolled, I could feel my own heart thrumming nervously. I wanted to tell him how I felt, but my own terror held me at bay. After the film, we decided to go for ice cream to unwind. As we sat at the small parlor, the atmosphere was thick with nerves and anticipation. I paused, just as he took a bite from his cone, and I said, "Hey, can I tell you something?" He turned to look at me, and my heart raced. Maybe this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I took a deep breath. "Honestly, I've had some feelings for you for a while now." Jay blinked, his expression unreadable, and I felt like 1,000 butterflies were flapping violently in my stomach. What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it," I blurted out. "I love you, Jay. Not just as a friend." I felt the heat of embarrassment flood my cheeks, but I forced myself to look him in the eye. There, in that moonlit parlor, everything felt suspended in time. I watched as he processed what I had just said, and a strange mix of emotions danced across his face. "Wow," he said, finally. "I didn't expect that." "I know," I hurried to say. "But I've been thinking a lot about it. I want you to be happy, and I want to support you." But I couldn't hide it any longer. The silence that followed felt like eternity, but then, to my surprise, a smile broke across Jay's face, warm and genuine. "You don't know how much that means to me," he said softly. "When I came out to you guys, I was terrified, but hearing you say that makes it so much easier." "So how do you feel?" I asked, my heart racing. "Honestly," he said, his eyes sparkling, "I've been feeling the same way. I just didn't know how to tell you. I kind of thought that since I was just figuring stuff out about myself, I shouldn't even think about something like that." My heart soared as he spoke, and I felt the weight of anxiety slipping away. We talked until the sun began to rise, sharing our dreams and fears. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, and the journey would be far from easy. But just like that night in the basement, I felt hope returning. It was a moment brimming with support and love, not only between friends but something deeper blooming between us. Jay and I faced the world together, learning and embracing our identities while holding each other's hands through it all. And I knew, no matter what happened, we would always support each other, because that, in itself, was its own kind of love. The end. I never thought much of myself growing up. While other kids were busy climbing trees and summoning the courage to ask their crushes out on dates, I was content to sit on the sidelines, just observing. That was until the day I was dragged out of my comfort zone, kicking and screaming, by circumstances I could never have anticipated. It started on a chilly autumn afternoon when I found myself trudging home from school, my backpack heavy with textbooks and insecurities. I had just been bullied again for my stutter, which seemed to embarrass those around me more than it did me most days. I took a shortcut through the woods that day, a path less traveled but somehow comforting in its solitude. The trees whispered secrets, and the rustling leaves seemed to echo my own yearning for escape. But something was off that day. The air felt charged, as if the atmosphere was pulsing with a strange energy. I heard a noise, a rustling, more than just leaves and branches, like a soft cry of distress. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound. I stumbled upon a clearing, where I found an old, weathered well, its stones slick with moisture and age. Perched at the edge was a girl, maybe a couple of years younger than me, her clothes torn and dirty, a haunting look in her eyes. Instinctively, I felt drawn to her. "Please help me," she sobbed, her voice trembling like the wisp of a dying flame. I approached cautiously, feeling adrenaline start to swirl in my chest, nearly drowning out the sound of my heart thumping wildly. "How did you get here?" I murmured, unsure if I was making a mistake. "I don't remember," she replied, shaking. "But I can feel them getting closer. Please, I don't have much time." I had no idea what she was talking about, but fear took root in my gut as I glanced around, half expecting something ominous to leap from behind the trees. Something compelled me to sit beside her, and I reached my hand out, willing to comfort her in a way I had never done for anyone else. "You're not alone." Suddenly, a thunderous crash echoed behind me, and I whipped around to see shadowy figures materializing in the distance, their forms nightmarish and grotesque. They had a gnarled quality, like they were made from the very darkness gathering in the sky. My previous courage fled, replaced by a paralyzing dread, but I didn't want to abandon this girl. I looked back at her, and she met my gaze, her desperation charging the air between us. "We have to run," I yelled, and somehow, I found the strength to pull her up. As we sprinted through the trees, the figures pursued us like angry storms, howling with fury. My mind raced, a whirlwind of panic, but there was a single thought I clung to: I had to protect her. We veered, ducking under branches, my legs aching with each desperate stride. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I recognized the irony. I had always viewed myself as weak, and now I was running for someone else, channeling every ounce of hidden strength I never knew I possessed. As we neared the edge of the woods, I spotted a shimmering light ahead. It flickered, a promise of safety, beckoning us like a lighthouse in a storm. "Keep running," I yelled, pushing myself harder as we neared the light, the howls of our pursuers growing more furious and closer. "Just a little more." The girl started to falter, and I could see the fear in her eyes, the dread of being caught. "Come on. We're almost there," I shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her along. In that moment, I felt an insatiable anger rise within me, fueled by the thought of how many times I had been pushed around in my life, of how weak I had let myself become. It ignited a fire inside, churning my fear into raw energy. The moment we broke through into the clearing, we were met with blinding light, and for a second, I thought we were safe. But the darkness screeched behind us, and the figures surged forward, their arms outstretched like tendrils of smoke. "I won't let them take you," I screamed, my voice surging with an intensity I had never known. That sudden realization pummeled into me: I was stronger than I thought. As the shadows reached for us, I felt an unearthly strength ripple through my body. I turned to face them, putting myself between the girl and the encroaching terror. My heart raced, not with fear, but with an undeniable power, an unshakable resolve. "You will not take her," I roared, and to my shock, a blinding light erupted from me, radiating outward like the sun slicing through the darkness. The figures recoiled, howling in anguish, and for a moment, I felt invincible. It wasn't just my physical strength, it was something deeper, a well of courage and conviction that I had kept buried beneath years of doubt. I took a step forward, fueling the light with my determination, picturing every time I had felt small, every time I had let others dictate who I was. The tendrils of shadow writhed and twisted in a futile attempt to advance, but they couldn't touch us. The girl stood beside me, her eyes wide with awe, and for the first time, I felt like I was in control. Without warning, the shadows began to dissipate, swirling and flickering away like an extinguished flame. As the last remnants faded into nothingness, I turned to the girl, who looked at me with gratitude washing over her features. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling now, but no longer from fear. In that moment, the knot of uncertainty that had gripped my heart for so long started to unravel. I realized that I had not just saved her, I had saved myself. I learned that day that courage doesn't always come from a place of fearlessness, but from facing those fears head-on and understanding that strength lies within us all. Somehow, I had found that hidden reservoir in the dark, and it had saved us both. From that day forward, I carried that lesson with me, no longer just the observer on the sidelines. I had transformed, awakened to the truth that I could seize control of my life in ways I had never imagined before, and I would never allow others to dictate my strength again. The shadows had been vanquished, not just by light, but with the fire of self-discovery, and that day became the cornerstone of who I wanted to be. I've never forgotten that moment, how powerful it felt to confront my own darkness while saving another soul in the process. And I promised myself that I would never let anyone, including myself, pull me back into the shadows again. I never really understood gratitude until it became a necessity for my survival. It all started when I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, far from the bustling city life I was used to. The air was crisper, the nights were darker, and the people were peculiar, to say the least. I didn't have a job lined up, I was just trying to escape the drudgery of my old life, thinking a change of scenery would heal my restless soul. Little did I know I'd find myself entangled in a nightmare that would ultimately teach me the value of gratitude and the power of perspective. My first few weeks went by in a blur, filled with long walks through the forest and attempting to set up my little cottage. It felt peaceful at first, but as days wore on, I began to notice strange occurrences around me. Things would go missing, my favorite mug, my keys, a book I had been reading, only to show up later in odd places like under the bed or in the refrigerator. When I spoke to the neighbors about it, they simply nodded with knowing smiles and said, "You'll get used to it." Used to what? I asked silently. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, a byproduct of too much silence and too little human interaction. But then one night, while trying to prepare for bed, I heard whispers coming from outside my window. It sounded like laughter mixed with soft humming, and it sent chills down my spine. I pulled the curtains tight, convincing myself it was the wind or some nocturnal animal. Yet, the strings of uneasy tension in my gut unraveled that night when I closed my eyes. Sleep clutched at my thoughts, but then a dream took me to a familiar place. I was wandering through a dark forest, disoriented and afraid, the whispers echoing around me. They grew louder, pleading, begging. I remember one figure stepping into the moonlight, an older woman with wild hair and deep-set eyes that glimmered with mischief. She smiled, but it was empty, void of any warmth. "You're not grateful," she whispered, her breath ghosting over my skin like a chill. I jolted awake, my heart racing, the room cloaked in darkness. That was when I understood that I couldn't keep living in ungrateful silence. The very next day, I ventured deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my mind and maybe even confront whatever spirit had invaded my dreams. The trees towered above me, branches intertwining like gnarled fingers trying to hold me back. Just when I thought I would turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing with an ancient-looking stone altar at its center. It was covered in moss and surrounded by vibrant flowers that somehow thrived in the shade. It was breathtaking, and I felt a strange compulsion to kneel before it. As I knelt, I summoned all my worries, my fears, and my anger. But from these dark places, gratitude began to blossom. I thought of the coffee I sipped every morning, the warmth of my lined sweater against the chill, the beauty of the forest around me. I uttered quiet thanks for the air in my lungs and the ground beneath me. And as those words escaped my lips, something magical happened. The wind picked up, swirling around me, rustling the leaves and lifting the flowers from their slumber. The whispered laughter returned, now sounding jubilant and harmonious, no longer a source of anxiety, but a celebration of life. I didn't look behind me, but I could feel them, those who had been watching, waiting for me to learn. Day after day, I returned to that sacred clearing. I cultivated gratitude through ritual, each acknowledgement like a seed planted in rich soil. With each visit, the spirits grew closer, their forms shifting in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. They didn't torment me anymore, they danced along with my thoughts, accepting my offerings of thanks. I began to embrace the wonders of my mundane life. Every small act became an opportunity for gratitude. When I found my missing items, I laughed instead of groaned, thanking the spirits for the reminder to appreciate the little things. I started to forge connections with my neighbors, sharing meals and stories. I realized they weren't strange, they were just alive in a way that was foreign to me. I finally felt like a part of this community, a web of gratitude and understanding. But there was something lurking at the edge of my new perspective. I knew I was being watched, but not in a malicious way. They were waiting for the moment when I would fully understand. On a particularly foggy morning, I dreamt of the old woman again. She stood before me, no longer a sinister figure but a wise sage dressed in flowing robes made of winds and shadows. "You've learned well," she said, her voice soothing my lingering fears. "But there's one more lesson." I followed her design, wading through the fog until we reached an expansive, dark lake shimmering under an ethereal light. "Face the depths," she beckoned. With great trepidation, I approached the water's edge and peered into my reflection. Staring back at me was my fear, all the anger and loneliness I had tried to bury. "You must accept even this," she told me. "Only then will you truly be free." And in that moment, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the frigid water, feeling it surge around me, enveloping me in its icy grasp. I recognized my past failures, the shadows that had clung to my spirit. And instead of fighting, I surrendered, embracing every struggle, every sorrow. I emerged gasping for air, renewed, the weight of my past no longer dragging me down. The lake, once dark and foreboding, sparkled with hues of gratitude I had never witnessed before. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, filled with a newfound appreciation for everything the world offered. The spirits began to take form more often, no longer mere shadows but shimmering lights, guiding me through the tasks of everyday life. They helped me navigate the complexities of relationships, urged me to speak kind words and dress my thoughts in gratitude. Then, one evening, as I ventured back to the altar for my ritual, the night air filled with warmth and laughter. The community had gathered to celebrate harvest season, their joy infectious. I smiled and joined the festivities, no longer an outsider but a cherished part of the fabric woven into their lives. Gratitude had transformed my darkness into light, my fears into strength. And as the stars twinkled above, I felt the spirits dancing among us, celebrating my journey in ways I could have never imagined. In the end, it was gratitude that saved me, not because the darkness vanished, but because I learned to coexist with it, transforming my fear into appreciation. And every day since then, I find something to be thankful for, knowing that the cadence of life sways in rhythm with the whispers of invisible friends guiding me through the intricate dance of existence. I still walk through the woods, where laughter and whispers weave a tapestry of understanding, gratitude forever etched into my heart, my new normal holding an eerie yet beautiful semblance of what I once feared. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon when I decided to volunteer at the community shelter for the first time. I had recently moved to a new city, feeling adrift and largely disconnected from my surroundings, so I thought that maybe giving back could anchor me. I arrived at the shelter, greeted by the unmistakable scent of cleaning supplies mingling with the faint waft of something simmering in the kitchen. The place felt warm and chaotic, the air thick with chatter and laughter. As I stepped inside, a mixture of excitement and nerves fluttered in my chest. I met Sarah, a veteran volunteer with a contagious smile, who quickly showed me the ropes. "Tonight's special is soup and sandwiches," she said, bustling around with an energy I admired. I was assigned to the serving line, dishing out food to those arriving for a meal. Families, singles, and even people who looked like they'd just fallen on hard times flowed in steadily, their expressions ranging from gratitude to a haunting emptiness that made me uncomfortable. I began to lose myself in the rhythm of serving, repeating enjoy and welcome as I passed out steaming bowls of soup. As the evening progressed, an old man shuffled in, his clothes tattered and worn, his eyes lost in a fog of memories I felt too afraid to unearth. When I handed him the soup, he looked up at me, and for a split second, I felt a jolt, an unsettling connection between us. "Thank you, young one," he said, his voice hoarse yet somehow soothing. "Do you ever feel like you're searching for something? Like a piece of yourself just lost?" I wasn't sure how to answer. I merely nodded, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. Over the next few hours, I served food and shared fleeting smiles with the guests, but the old man's words lingered like a ghost in the back of my mind. As the last meal was served and the dining area began to clear, I noticed the old man sitting alone at a table, his soup untouched. Curiosity gnawed at me, and despite the busy closing activities, I approached him cautiously. "Hi, do you mind if I join you?" I asked. He looked up, his gaze piercing through the layers of my persona, and he finally nodded. We exchanged pleasantries, and I learned his name was Harold. He told me he had once been a teacher, deeply passionate about sharing knowledge, but life had thrown him curveballs that led him into this drab routine. I listened hard, captivated by his stories, each word laced with a wisdom I craved. It may have been naive, but I felt that holding space with him, however briefly, filled a void I hadn't even known existed. Just as I was getting lost in his tales, he leaned in closer and said something that sent shivers down my spine. Life is a tapestry of moments, but sometimes, the threads unravel. You must be ready to weave them back together or risk being lost in the chaos. His warning resonated with an unshakable intensity, and I left the shelter that night feeling different, purposeful. I started volunteering regularly, each experience weaving new threads into the tapestry of my life. But every time I returned, it was as if the atmosphere grew heavier, haunted by glimmers of melancholy that hung in the air. One evening, I arrived to find the place unusually empty. The director explained that several families had been placed into housing and that we'd be closing early. I felt a deep sense of loss, like an integral piece of my routine had been swept away. Just as I was about to leave, I spotted Harold sitting in the corner, his usual expression replaced by something unreadable. I approached him, and he looked up with an odd smile. "They're moving on," he said, gesturing around the now quiet room. "But this isn't an ending. It's a beginning." Something in his tone hinted that he saw more than I did about the world. I felt drawn to him, sensing he carried a truth waiting to be uncovered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's an unseen thread connecting all of us, you know? Sometimes, it takes a gentle tug to reveal it." His eyes glimmered with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Tonight, you need to follow that thread." An odd thrill shot through me, mingled with fear as I wondered what he could mean. But before I could voice my concern, the lights flickered ominously, and a sudden chill settled over the room. I can't explain it, I just felt it, an almost primal urge telling me to trust Harold. He stood and gestured for me to follow him out of the shelter. We walked in silence, and an inexplicable energy crackled in the air, guiding us, until we found ourselves at an old, decrepit park. I recognized a bench where I had sat during the day, but now it was shrouded in darkness. "Do you see it?" he asked, pointing to a spot where the moonlight shimmered. Squinting, I caught sight of a small, weathered box half buried in the soil. Harold took my hand and urged me to dig it out. My heart pounded lifelessly in my chest as I unearthed the box, shaking dirt off its surface. What could be inside? Was this real? "Go ahead," he encouraged, his voice steady. I hesitated but eventually flicked open the rusty latch. Inside, crumpled papers lay, stained and yellowed, signatures, births, and losses, and mixed among them was a silver locket. Trembling, I opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a young boy and a woman with a smile that pierced through the fog of unease surrounding me. "That's my son," Harold whispered, his voice suddenly breaking. "I lost him years ago. I thought I'd never find him again." I felt a quick source of sorrow like a slap across my face. "Your son?" I asked, searching his eyes. "How can you be so sure?" He lifted his hand, pointing at the locket. This was his. "One day, it'll be back with me." He spoke with a devotion that felt almost supernatural, as if the universe had conspired to bring me into his orbit precisely when the threads of his life were ready to be rewoven. "You found it," he said with a semblance of peace, "but you have to share the moment with others so they can remember too." A strange compulsion gripped me, and I felt the urge to shout, to tell the world about this discovery, about the loss and love encapsulated in this modest box. By finding Harold's locket, I finally grasped the essence of what it meant to truly volunteer, elevating my purpose beyond serving food but rather, bringing people together. We stood there, breathless, and suddenly, it all clicked: the people who came to the shelter, the lives intertwined, the threads of fate binding us in ways we could never understand until moments like this punctuated our existence. But then, as if the air snapped back into focus, Harold grew distant again, his eyes clouded yet brimming with something almost sacred. "Share the story, my friend." Don't let it fade into memory. And just like that, with a flickering of the stars overhead, he vanished from my side before my very eyes. I stumbled backward, grappling with the fact that he was gone. In the weeks that followed, I told everyone about that night. I shared the story of Harold, the lost locket, and the beauty of connection. There was an outpouring of emotion from others, retelling their stories of loss and hopes rekindled. I took solace in knowing that in the rolling wave of memories, there lay a greater purpose for all of us. I still volunteer at the shelter, weaving the stories of lives intertwined, always seeking meaningful connections. Harold taught me what it means to live, not just breathing through the days but embracing the tapestry of existence with all its baleful threads and joyfully woven experiences, and even now, I feel like he's watching over me, whispering through the fabric of my life, reminding me that within every moment, we can find purpose, even in the most unexpected of places. I always thought I was the kind of person who played it safe, which is why, when I stumbled upon the advertisement for the Night of New Experiences, I found myself hesitating at first. It was an immersive event promised to take place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where attendees would participate in challenges that would push their boundaries and make them confront their fears. Part of me thought it was going to be some ridiculous gimmick, something designed for thrill seekers who lived on the edge, but another part of me was curious. So here I was, standing in front of the weather-beaten doors of that warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced at the 24 strangers milling around under the flickering industrial lights. Each wore different expressions from nervous anticipation to full-blown excitement, but I felt more like an intruder in a club I didn't belong to. Ultimately, I decided to give it a go. Maybe it was time to step outside my comfort zone. The night began innocuous enough. We were split into groups, and the first task thrown at us was a scavenger hunt within the dimly lit confines of the warehouse. It involved finding various hidden items that quickly turned mundane under the veil of darkness. My group bonded momentarily as we rummaged through whatever we could find, and by the end, I was surprised at how much I was enjoying myself. But then things took a sharp turn. After the scavenger hunt came a challenge that sounded really ridiculous out loud, the truth or dare chamber. Participants were to take turns choosing between answering a question that could expose a deep vulnerability or performing a bizarre dare. I aimed to blend in and maintain that playful spirit, so when it was my turn, I quickly chose dare, thinking nothing could be worse than admitting my childhood fear of clowns. Only then did I realize with gut-wrenching dread that I would have to dance with a strange man in a giant chicken suit, blindfolded, no less. The laughter from my peers funneled me to abandon my inhibitions, so I complied, letting the ridiculousness of the situation carry me forward. It felt liberating, until I accidentally stepped on his foot, and he yelped like a wounded bird. We staggered apart, both of us laughing uncontrollably, and for a moment, I relaxed. But then came the twist. The event organizers announced that we were entering the last phase of the night, the Confront Your Fears zone. An uneasy silence settled over the group as they illuminated a separate entrance lined with what looked like smoke and mysterious, pulsing lights. I felt chills run down my spine but sucked in a deep breath, hungry to surprise myself yet again. Stepping inside was like wandering into a world that defied logic. The darkness was thick, and the ensuing fog obscured anything beyond a few feet. The host's voice boomed from somewhere in the distance, an ominous tone. Face the fears that haunt you. Embrace the darkness. You will each be confronted by manifestations of what you dread most. The first person from my group went in, a girl named Sarah who screamed almost instantly, and I felt the pit of my stomach drop. I followed behind her, ignited by an odd mixture of dread and determination. Inside, I was enveloped by eerie sounds and flashes of light, as shadows twisted around me, each unidentifiable entity representing a fear I had never fully acknowledged. I mean, who wouldn't be afraid in a place like this? It was primal. But then I saw it. Amid the swirling chaos, a figure began to emerge, tall and unsettling, cloaked in shadow. And yet, through that veil, a familiar face slowly became clear. It was my younger self, his wide, fearful eyes staring back at me. I felt my breath hitch as the apparition grew closer, mirroring my scars and memories. In the next thrilling moment, I realized it was not trying to terrorize me. Instead, it was simply showing me a memory, a boy too afraid to step onto the starting line of a race. Memories poured in, enveloping me, demanding that I face all the moments when I felt inadequate, all the opportunities I'd let slip by out of fear. My younger self reached for me, whispering a single command: run. Suddenly, I was filled with an insatiable adrenaline rush, summoning the bravado that eluded me in my youth. In that crazy space, I finally realized what all those fears had created: a wall between me and the life I wanted to live. I took a deep breath and sprinted past the shadowy figure of my past, through the dense fog. The inner child's eyes sparkled with understanding, as if telling me it was all right to let go. When I emerged from the zone, I felt dizzy, disoriented, and utterly reborn. My heart raced not with fear but with a newfound thrill. Surrounded by the triumphant cheers of my fellow attendees, I shared the experience, and my laughter mingled with theirs, fueling me to embrace everything profound I had just faced. As the night culminated, I realized that pushing boundaries isn't simply about immersing in adventure, it's about recognizing the weight of our fears while finding the strength to challenge them. I went home that night, sleepless, exhilarated, and undeniably changed. I learned that life should never be about tiptoeing along the edges, it should be about diving headfirst into the unknown. Pushing our limits can lead to the most breathtaking surprises, and who knows? Sometimes, what you discover about yourself can truly redefine your journey. So now, with this shared adventure engraved in my soul, I firmly stand as someone who dares to try something new. And if this story finds you lurking at the edge of your own comfort zone, I hope you dive in, because you might just find something extraordinary waiting on the other side. I remember the day it all started. It was one of those evenings when the dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, and the air was thick with the scent of impending rain. I was sitting in my cluttered living room, trying to put together the pieces of my chaotic life. You know the feeling when everything seems to spiral out of control? That was me, overworked, underappreciated, and desperately trying to salvage a mistake I made a week ago. I had sent an email to my boss containing an outrageous critique of his management style, meant for my best friend. Of course, like a moron, I hit send without double-checking. The aftermath was brutal: awkward encounters at work, hushed conversations among my colleagues, and, worst of all, a very stiff meeting with my boss where he told me he would be keeping an eye on my future contributions. I couldn't let this slide. I had to fix it. So, fueled by desperation and a few too many cups of coffee, I decided to confront this blunder head-on. My plan? To craft an elaborate apology, one that would not only clear my name but also secure my position in the company. That night, I tossed and turned, brainstorming the perfect words to soothe the bruised ego of my superior. And then, inspiration hit me like a freight train. I remembered a tactic I read about once: symbolism. An apology that touches the heart, I thought, will surely be more memorable. With that, I headed out to the local convenience store, determined to execute my plan. I was going to buy a gift for my boss, something small yet meaningful. As I strolled through the dimly lit aisles, I stumbled upon a shelf lined with trinkets and oddities. Among them was a little wooden box adorned with intricate carvings. It seemed to call out to me. I picked it up and noticed a tiny latch. Something felt strange about it, almost as if it held secrets inside. I bought the box, feeling like I might finally have the edge I needed. Back home, I spent hours crafting my apology. My words flowed, and they were sincere, heartfelt. Once finished, I carefully placed my neatly folded letter inside the wooden box. Just as I was about to seal it, a subtle shiver ran down my spine. The box felt cooler than it should have, and it seemed to hum slightly in my hands. Dismissing it as my overactive imagination, I put it aside and headed to bed. The next morning, I awoke to a strange atmosphere in my apartment. It felt heavy, almost suffocating. I shrugged it off, picked up the box, and went to work. When I arrived, I was surprised to see my boss in a particularly good mood. Surprising, given our last encounter, I thought. I approached him hesitantly, handed him the box, and braced myself for the fallout. To my astonishment, he unlatched the box and smiled as he read my letter. "I appreciate this," he said, a genuine warmth in his voice. I felt the weight lift, and a smile crept onto my face. But then something strange happened. As he pulled out a small object from the box that was hidden underneath my letter, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The room darkened slightly, and the temperature dropped. The object was a small, fractured crystal that glimmered in unsettling colors. My boss's expression changed, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a sinister glint in his eyes. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice edged with a tone I had never heard before. I started to explain about the store and the box, but my words seemed to evaporate. The air thickened around us, and an uneasy tension filled the space. His demeanor shifted, and I suddenly felt as if I was standing before something ancient and powerful. I dismissed my worries, convincing myself I was being dramatic. After all, I had salvaged my mistake, hadn't I? Just a harmless gift, nothing to worry about. Hours passed, and everything seemed normal, but a gnawing sense of dread crept into my gut. I spent a restless evening, replaying the day's events in my mind. When I finally fell asleep, I was jarred awake by a sound, an insistent tapping at my window. Heart racing, I peered through the glass and saw nothing but the darkened street. I shook it off, blaming it on the lingering anxiety from the day. Sleep called me back, but in that twilight between dreaming and waking, I heard whispers, soft, haunting murmurs that seemed to echo from the depths of the box. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. The box, which I had set on my bedside table, was now slightly ajar. Fear wrapped around me like a vice. I pushed back the curtains, peering outside, but all I saw were the shadows dancing in the streetlights. Then it hit me, what if I had unleashed something with that stupid gift? My mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. I remembered the stories I'd read, tales of cursed objects and sinister deals. I had messed with things I didn't understand. In the following days, I watched my boss grow increasingly erratic, seemingly overwhelmed by a presence I couldn't detect. He would stare off into the distance during meetings, muttering to himself. I noticed strange occurrences around the office, equipment malfunctioning, papers stirring on their own, whispers echoing in the halls. I began to connect the dots, linking the box and my predicament. In a fit of panic, I made a decision. I had to get rid of that cursed thing before it consumed everything I held dear. I waited until the office was empty and slipped the box into a large trash bin outside. The moment it left my hands, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. However, that night, the tapping returned, now more insistent than before. I woke, heart pounding, and stumbled toward the window, gasping as I saw my reflection, dark circles around my sunken eyes, skin pale and drawn. I was a shell of my former self. The hull of the wind seemed to carry voices, calling my name, pleading for me to return to the box. I couldn't bear it any longer. I drove back to the store, desperate to find answers. The store was gone, just an empty lot where the flickering neon sign used to be. I scrambled through the dirt, searching for any remnants, but it was as if the place had never existed. Overwhelmed with despair, I returned home, only to be confronted by the shadows lurking in every corner. What had I done? Days turned into weeks. I lost my job, my friends drifted away, and I became a recluse, haunted by the entity I had unwittingly called forth. The crystal I had given to my boss was nowhere to be found, as if it had absorbed everything about my life. One night, paralyzed by insomnia, I sat in the darkness, pondering my choices. I put the remaining pieces together, my oblivion to the repercussions of my actions, the lesson I had somehow overlooked. Perhaps it was the universe's way of teaching me about responsibility, about respecting the impacts of my errors. I couldn't fix what was broken, but I had to learn from it. With that revelation, I finally drifted into a deep sleep, devoid of nightmares. A day later, I awoke to a bright sun streaming through the window, a warmth I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. I ventured outside, feeling the air clean and pure for the first time in ages. The shadows had receded, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. With determination, I decided to rebuild my life, cobbling together what I had learned along the way. That's when I noticed a new shop opening down the street, a vibrant place with colorful signs and laughter spilling out. As I approached, a wave of familiarity washed over me. Yet, I knew better now, for in my heart, I understood that some things are better left undisturbed. As dark and harrowing as my journey had been, I walked away knowing the most important lesson of all: every mistake carries its burden, its lesson, and its potential for growth. I swore to carry this insight with me, aware that life would continue to test me, but this time, I would be ready. This time, I would choose wisdom over impulsivity, courage over cowardice, and above all, I would embrace the beautiful chaos that is living. In the end, the mistakes we make are just markers on our path to becoming who we are meant to be. I've always been a bit of a loner, but I had friends who tolerantly put up with me. I was the one known for my quick wit and biting sarcasm, often cracking jokes while making a sharp comment at someone else's expense. It was all in good fun, I told myself, but as I sat on my bed replaying another night of laughs and scorn in my head, I began to question the real cost of my humor. It was Halloween night, and I was determined to be the life of the party. Everyone was gathered at Chloe's house, a big 2-story monstrosity on the edge of town. I arrived a bit late, but with my typical entrance style, throwing out jokes left and right, I quickly became the center of attention. As the hours ticked by, my jokes grew sharper, each quip carefully crafted as a blade, cutting through the atmosphere of harmless fun. But that night, I crossed a line I didn't even know existed. During a game of truth or dare, a game where you could either be honest or do something ridiculous, I knew I had the opportunity to slip in one of my trademark jabs. When Evan, a kind-hearted guy who had been a punching bag for my jokes more times than I could count, drew the short straw, he picked truth. I could see him shifting nervously, he was always scared of what I might say. My eyes sparkled with mischief as I asked him when he would finally get over his crush on Chloe. The room erupted in laughter, but Evan's face dropped. His pale cheeks flushed crimson. "Dude, come on," he stammered, his voice cracking. I had expected him to just chuckle, to roll with the joke as he always did. Instead, he shot me an incredulous look, one that seemed to penetrate my usual facade of humor. Suddenly, the mood shifted, and the laughter died. Chloe, who had been giggling along with everyone else, gave me a sharp glance. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just Evan being sensitive, and we moved on to another round. The party continued, but that moment lingered in my mind like a shadow. Hours later, the party had mellowed, and people started to trickle out, leaving only me, Evan, and Chloe. I could feel the atmosphere thick with awkwardness. Chloe confronted me, her voice low. "You shouldn't have said that, you know?" I started to protest, trying to mask my defensiveness with casual bravado. But before I could gather my flimsy arguments, Evan quietly chimed in, "It's not the first time you've said something like that about me, you realize." His voice was steady but hurt, and it struck me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I always thought we were just joking, but hearing it come from him made me realize it was never funny to him. He looked me directly in the eye, and for just a moment, I dropped my mortality. I felt dizzy with the gravity of the moment, as if gravity had shifted. The weight of his pain stuck to the air between us. I tried to apologize, but the words felt useless, flailing around in the void. In that instance, a chill surged through me, an icy current that whispered the truth I had ignored for years. Words have power, and I had let mine wield blades instead of bridges. Evan turned away, and Chloe's disappointed gaze fell upon me like a shroud. That was the day I realized the impact of my words in a way I never had before. I spent the next days in quiet reflection, confronting how I had always enjoyed being the class clown at others' expenses. I worried about Evan. I reached out over the subsequent weeks, but he had gone largely quiet, retreating from our usual hangouts, and gradually, I saw the friends I once had begin to fade like ghosts. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon a post Evan made. It was a photo taken at a lonely old park bench, captioned, "Sometimes it's better to walk away from things that are bad for you. Words can cut deeper than any blade." It rattled me, leaving me immobilized. I had not only hurt him, I had pushed him away and shattered a friendship that once meant the world to me. As time passed, I grew increasingly burdened by the way I had treated others. I reached out to our mutual friends, but anecdotes quickly passed from their lips, emphasizing how my words had always overshadowed my kindness. It felt as if I was clinging to a collapsing facade. I started speaking less, caught in a web of doubt about what I should share and what jokes were appropriate. Conversations ebbed, laughter turned sterile, and for once, I felt what true isolation was like. When I finally decided to reach out to Evan, I stood outside his house, heart pounding, trying to come up with the right words. The same words that had failed me before now felt insurmountable. I knocked on his door, my throat dry as I waited. Time slowed. It felt like an eternity before I finally heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and there he stood, his face still carrying that familiar hint of hurt. "What do you want?" he asked, cold and clipped. I took a deep breath, grappling with the weight of my emotions and the truth I desperately needed to share. "I'm sorry," I said, every syllable laced with remorse. "I didn't realize how much my words affected you until it was too late. I want to make it right." I watched as his eyes flickered, the defensiveness softening into something more complicated. He studied me for a long moment before shaking his head. "It's not that simple, man." And just like that, my heart shattered. I could feel the world closing in again, the crushing weight of the regret that had followed me for months. But I stood my ground. "I know it isn't. But I want to try. If you'll let me. I want to learn how to be better. Not just for you but for everyone else I've hurt." "I never meant for my humor to turn cruel," he sighed, his body language still tense but wavering. "It's going to take time, and I'm not going to forget what happened. But I'll hear you out." Over the following weeks, we talked. Slowly, Evan opened up, sharing not only his experience but encouraging me to express my frustrations as well. It was hard. I had to face the parts of myself that I had long hidden, the insecurities, the anger, the lazy humor that cloaked my pain. And with each conversation, I started to understand the real power of words. They were not just great in jest, they could offer healing, understanding, and connection. Evan and I eventually found common ground again. Through honesty and reflection, I made a promise to be cautious with what I said and to create a space where my words could spark joy rather than division. I can't say things are back to the way they were. They might never be. But every time I walk past that old park bench, I remind myself of the cost of my words and the relationships they can build or break. The day I realized their impact was a painful moment of truth, but it became the catalyst for my journey into kindness, healing, and real friendship. Because words wield a power that, once you learn to control it, can carve pathways to a world where understanding and love can bloom. It was a rainy Thursday when I stumbled across an old, weathered notebook in the back of my closet. I don't remember where it came from, but the moment I opened it, I felt that familiar shiver trail down my spine. The pages, yellowed with time, were filled with notes and entries from someone who had poured their soul onto the paper. The words were messy, frantic, filled with an inexplicable blend of despair and hope. The first entry caught my eye. "I found joy in helping others, but it comes at a cost." I flipped through more pages, each one detailing eerie encounters with people in need, like the time the writer found a homeless man eating scraps from a dumpster and decided to give him his lunch, a gesture that spiraled into something dark and unsettling. The narrative woven through the notebook suggested that every act of kindness led to a profound shift in reality, blurring the line between benevolence and something sinister. "I helped him, and in return, I lost a part of myself," he had written. As I continued reading, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. The writer described how every time they lent a hand, to a child, a widow, an abandoned pet, something inexplicable happened. They became more detached from their own feelings and experiences, as if helping others drained their essence like the lifeblood of an unsuspecting victim. In a twisted way, it felt exhilarating. I could relate. I had always found solace in helping others, in the idea that my actions could spark joy in someone else's life, but I had never felt the intensity of those encounters as described in the notebook. After hours of reading, my head spun with excitement and dread. I had to try it for myself. I decided to spend a week focusing solely on helping others, giving my time and energy to those in need, believing that perhaps I could find joy just as the writer did. I kicked off my quest that very Friday by volunteering at a local soup kitchen. The faces of people receiving meals were filled with gratitude, and as I slipped sandwiches into their hands, I felt a rush of warmth. I stayed late, cleaning up, chatting with volunteers, and basking in the glow of camaraderie. It felt amazing. The next day, I found myself on a park bench, watching a young woman struggle with her 2 children. Without a second thought, I approached her and offered to help, carrying her bags while she wrangled her kids. She was overwhelmed, nearly in tears, and thanked me profusely. But something uninvited stirred beneath the surface, an almost intoxicating pull, and whatever joy I felt started morphing into a creeping numbness. I brushed it aside, chalking it up to fatigue. Sunday came, and I organized a small donation drive in my neighborhood, gathering clothes and toys for those in need. When I delivered them, the grateful looks of the recipients filled me with pride, but when I got home, an oppressive silence settled over me. The joy I had expected felt hollow, as if I had been suffocated by obligation rather than buoyed by altruism. By the end of the week, I was sleep-deprived and weirdly detached. Each act of kindness seemed to consume more of my essence, leaving me disjointed and restless. I opened the notebook again, scanning for clues about what had gone wrong. There at the end, a chilling entry caught my eye. The writer explained that a price was paid for every good deed, a piece of the self, an energy that would forever be absent. I thought I was helping others, it read, but each act stole my joy and twisted it into something grotesque. I slammed the notebook shut, breathing heavily. No matter how many times I tried to grasp the joy of helping others, I could feel something darker creeping in, a shadow clinging to my thoughts. By the week's end, I was a shell of my former self. I realized that with every person I had tried to uplift, I had unknowingly made a sacrifice, not in possessions or time, but a gradual erosion of my happiness. But despite the dread in my gut, I needed to push through, to defy the impending panic. My last act of kindness was supposed to be the easiest, helping a neighbor who had just lost a family member. I brought flowers and offered to help clean. When I entered her home, the heaviness was palpable. It wasn't just grief that suffocated the air, it was something else, something dark that twisted around my heart. I sat with her on the couch, shuffling through awkward conversations, but the longer we talked, the more I felt myself slipping away. Suddenly, she confessed that her family had been haunted by something sinister, a malevolent force they couldn't shake off. My head spun, and I wanted to laugh it off, to claim it's just a figment of grief, but the way her eyes glimmered with desperation froze the words in my throat. She looked at me as if I were her last hope, and I couldn't turn away. Against my will, empathy surged. I held her hand tightly, insisting I would help her find closure. I was withdrawing from my joy, infusing it into her sadness. I could sense the darkness creeping over me as she cried out her fears. At that moment, laughter erupted from her children, breaking the tension for an instant. But I felt twisted inside. I was giving too much, and the terrible realization gnawed at me. What if this darkness was contagious? The feeling erupted into panic. I yanked my hand back and bolted out of the house, feeling utterly shattered. I collapsed onto my porch, trembling, the notebook in my hands. I could no longer deny it, a song of joy couldn't be danced to if it was laced with such darkness. As I finished realizing the toll my good intentions had taken on me, the rain began to fall again, but this time, instead of cleansing, I felt it smothering. I vowed to never touch that cursed notebook again, or help anyone in such a profound way. But as I write this, I can still hear echoes of my voice crying out for a return to joy, bumping against my ears like a haunting melody stuck on repeat. Then I close my eyes, wishing the next day would bring light instead of the ever-growing despair that shadows me now. I know I sought joy in helping others, but with the notebook beneath my bed, I find myself lost in a darkness I never anticipated, haunted by the choice to lend my hand. I always fancied myself a tough guy. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, you either learned to stand your ground or became a victim of someone else's. I took pride in my ability to shrug off pain, whether it was physical or emotional. I was indifferent, you see, a wall of cynicism built around my heart. I believed that vulnerability was for the weak. Life had taught me that everyone was out for themselves, and no amount of empathy could change that. But one chilly October evening, while walking home from my dead-end job at the corner store, an encounter turned my world upside down. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows grew long as I approached a familiar alleyway. I did the usual check for suspicious figures lurking in the darkness. That's when I heard it, a quiet sobbing, muffled but unmistakable. Curiosity got the better of me, leading me to the mouth of the alley. It was then I saw her, a teenage girl curled up against the brick wall, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She was trembling, and I could feel an unwelcome twinge of unease crawling up my spine. Part of me wanted to turn away, chalk it up to some other kid's bad night, but instead, I found myself taking a tentative step closer. "Hey," I said awkwardly, immediately regretting the words. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide and glazed, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. "No," she croaked, her voice cracking like fragile glass. My gut tightened at the rawness of her pain, but the words barely registered as I tried to process what was happening. "What happened?" I asked, and to my absolute surprise, she started to pour her heart out. Her story tumbled from her lips in an avalanche of broken dreams and despair. She had just lost her mother to cancer and was forced to live with an abusive uncle who took every opportunity to reinforce how worthless she was. I stood there, feeling like a statue, my tough guy facade crumbling. It was hard to understand the pain she described. I had never been thrust into such darkness. While the stories I'd heard from friends about their families seemed trite compared to what this girl was enduring, something in me broke open. As she spoke, my mind whirled with fragmented memories of insults I had hurled to toughen people up, taunts I had ridiculed those vulnerable to fit in. My heart raced, and for the first time, I felt that crushing weight of empathy, the understanding of someone else's suffering resonating painfully in my own chest. I squatted down, trying to meet her gaze. "You're not worthless," I murmured, the words soft and awkward. "You're not alone, either." I expected her to scoff or roll her eyes, but instead, her tears flowed again, making her face glisten in the dim light. Something inside me shifted. I was no longer just an observer in her pain. I was a participant. We talked for what seemed like hours while the autumn air bit at our exposed skin. We shared stories, bonded over the cruel nature of the world, and by the time I left the alley, I felt a sense of weightlessness, the heaviness of my cynicism replaced by some small ember of understanding. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that girl. I started to hesitate when ready to dismiss others' pain, considering instead how someone else might perceive their struggles. My coworkers noticed the slight change in me when I handed them the book I bought for a struggling friend. I started inviting friends out that I typically wouldn't have bothered. I wanted to do something meaningful for others, carrying the same compassion I found for that young girl into my everyday life. I often returned to that alley. I hoped to see her again. It didn't take long before I did. A week later, I found her sitting in the same spot. This time, she lit up at the sight of me. "You came back." Her face split into a smile, and I realized then how rare that was, considering the depths of her despair. I sat down next to her, and we picked up our conversations where we left off. I learned she loved drawing, an escape from her reality, yet her uncle had ripped that away by tossing her sketchbook in the trash. So, I bought her a new one. The next week, I brought her some colored pencils. She giggled through tears, and that sound was like music. Each time I returned, the laughter grew louder, the heaviness of her life felt lighter. She confided in me about her dreams, and I opened up about mine, a lifetime spent shielding myself from heartache and hiding my own fears beneath bravado. It was during that third visit that the shadows stretched long, and as we shared yet another deep laugh, I saw a figure at the alley mouth. The menacing build of her uncle loomed in the faint glow of the streetlight. My stomach dropped as I realized he was searching for her. My instinct kicked in. I grabbed her hand before she could speak. "Come with me," I whispered urgently, and we dashed deeper into the shadows, away from the growing threat. My heart raced, fear coursing through my veins. We zigzagged through alleyways until I led her to my tiny apartment in the next neighborhood over. She was terrified, yet trusting, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of her trust resting squarely upon my shoulders. For the next few days, she stayed with me as anxiety morphed into a new routine. I found myself protecting her more than I knew how, knowing by then the battles she faced. But all my efforts lay bare in stark contrast to the horrors waiting beyond my door. One cold evening, as we watched old cartoons and shared laughs, I heard an insistent banging. My heart sank. I looked at her, her eyes wide with terror. "It's him," she whispered. I rushed to the door, but the pounding continued, relentless. I told her to hide. She ducked into the bathroom, fear plastered across her face. I knew if he got in, he'd hurt both of us. I faced what courage I could muster, opened the door, and was met by her uncle's furious and bloated visage. "Where is she?" He spat, his eyes wild with rage. I stood my ground, but something in me felt small against the fury radiating from him. He shoved past me, and I instinctively lunged forward, desperate to protect her. The adrenaline surged through me, and a primal need to defend arose. I took a wild swing, hitting him squarely in the nose. He staggered back, momentarily disoriented, but it wasn't enough. He lunged at me, fists moving like a whirlwind. The next moments turned into a blur of chaos. We grappled, the dull ache of pain seeping into my muscles as I slammed against the wall, trying to keep him from reaching her. Each punch exchanged felt like snapping twigs in a silence shattered by muffled fear. It was a primal dance of brutality and instinct, and as he swung again, the sickening crunch of his hand against my ribs shattered my focus. Every blow that landed resonated with guilt, the thought of her seeing me become what I despised held me captive. But then I remembered her laughter, her dreams, her vulnerability intertwined with my newfound empathy. It fueled my resolve, surging through the pain. I drove myself forward, pushing him back, surprise etching across his face as I landed another hit. And finally, he stumbled back, gasping in a mix of shock and fury. "You think you can keep her?" he screamed, before taking off into the night. Breathing heavily, I turned to the bathroom. "It's okay. It's over." But when I opened the door, she wasn't there. Panic cascaded over me, a wave of despair flooding my heart. I searched frantically, calling her name, only to hear nothing but echoing silence. My worst fears spun out of control as the minutes felt like hours. I stumbled back into the living room, heart racing, when the door creaked back. I whipped my head up to find her standing there, trembling yet determined, clutching a small backpack filled with her drawings. "I'm leaving," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. My heart shattered. "No, you don't have to," I pleaded, the empathy I had found burning hotter than ever. "Stay. We can fight this together." But she shook her head, the weight of her fears anchoring her spirit. "You've been so kind, but I can't let him find me. You deserve better, you can't fight this battle for me." She turned to leave, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. And in that moment, I learned the hardest lesson of all, the depths of sacrifice, how empathy can compel someone to let go, to let a small flame flicker out for the greater good. I stood paralyzed with grief as she vanished, the intimacy we had built now a haunting memory. Days passed, then weeks. Life resumed its predictable course, but I carried her memories with me, each encounter echoing faintly in my heart. I still walked those alleyways, haunted by her absence, the harsh reality of her struggles serving as a constant reminder of my failure to protect someone so deserving. But through that pain, I learned something ineffably valuable, that no act of empathy is ever wasted. As I forged deeper connections with those around me, I began to understand humanity on a level I had never reached before, using that experience to reach others suffering in silence. I became their strength, their voice. Empathy had etched itself into my soul, a guiding light against the encroaching darkness. It taught me that our struggles are never in vain, that each connection, painful or beautiful, is a step toward healing. And as I closed my eyes each night, I hoped that wherever she was finding a sense of hope that I could one day share with others. The importance of empathy hadn't just changed me, it had saved me, marking the beginning of my journey toward not just understanding pain, but conquering it together. I never considered myself a strong person. In fact, I often felt like I was floating through life, always just on the periphery of everything, never really engaged. But that changed one night when I decided to take a hiking trip in the local woods, a place I'd grown up near but never truly explored. I thought it might be a fun escape from my monotonous routine. The woods were dense, ancient trees twisting together in a way that felt like a living labyrinth, whispering secrets I wasn't privy to. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and I decided to push further onto a path that felt too enchanting to abandon. After an hour of wandering, I stumbled upon an old cabin, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, as if it had been swallowed by the forest. Something about it pulled me in, a mix of curiosity and foolish bravery compelling me to explore its dark interior. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decaying wood. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I stepped deeper into the cabin, I noticed strange carvings on the walls, symbols and hieroglyphs that seemed to shift in the dim light. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustle coming from the far corner of the room. Panic surged as I turned, half expecting to see a wild animal or a lost hiker, but what I saw chilled me to the bone. A figure, tall and shadowy, emerged from the darkness. Its features were indistinct, cloaked in shadows. Fear gripped my heart, but instead of running, I felt an inexplicable urge to confront whatever this was. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure raised its hand, pointing to the symbols on the wall. Then, to my shock, it spoke, though its voice was a mere whisper that felt both distant and near. "You seek strength, yet you are lost. To find it, you must face your fears." Just then, the ground shook, and the cabin lurched around me. The shadows deepened. I was suddenly standing at the edge of a vast abyss, the cabin nowhere to be seen. I felt a crushing weight of isolation. My heart raced. I had to decide, would I jump into the unknown, or turn back, spiral again into the safety of ignorance? It was the first challenge. The silence around me was deafening, each moment stretching into infinity. I thought about my life, the self-doubt, the loneliness, the constant feeling of insignificance, and I realized that jumping into the void represented my deepest fears, my failures, the myriad reasons I felt weak. My heart pounded in my chest, but something else burned within me too, an ember of determination. I took a step toward the edge of the abyss, and my breath hitched in my throat. I edged closer, the unknown calling to me in a way I never anticipated. In that moment, I leapt, feeling the rush of air around me as I fell. But instead of plummeting into darkness, I began to rise. As I ascended, the air filled with colors, vivid reds and blues and greens, transforming the abyss into a breathtaking expanse of light. I was no longer afraid. I realized that embracing challenges head-on was my strength. I found myself soaring through this kaleidoscope, feeling freer than ever before. But the journey didn't stop there. I was set upon new trials, each infused with lessons that rang true. In one, I faced a storm, the skies turned dark, and winds howled. I stood my ground, feeling the power of resilience surge within me as I embraced the chaos. In another, I encountered a raging river, swift and treacherous, blocking my way. I had to find the courage to swim against the current, a task that left me breathless and exhausted, but I emerged victorious on the other side, every stroke strengthening my resolve. With each challenge conquered, I felt pieces of myself coming together, fitting into place like a puzzle I never knew existed. I realized that my strength wasn't in physical prowess but in my ability to confront fear, to embrace discomfort, and to push through obstacles. After what felt like a lifetime of trials, a final challenge awaited me, a mirror reflecting my deepest self. In its depths, I saw my insecurities, my failures, but also my potential, my growth, and all the battles I had fought. It was both haunting and liberating. As I gazed into the mirror, I understood that every hardship, every moment of doubt, had forged my identity, crafting a strength I would carry with me. In that instant, the shadowy figure returned, a faint smile on its featureless face. "You've learned well," it whispered. With those words, the mirror shattered, and I felt myself being pulled back into the woods. The cabin had vanished, leaving me standing alone among the trees as dawn broke, casting light through the leaves. My heart raced with the aftershocks of my journey. What had felt like an ordinary hike had transformed into a rite of passage. In conquering the unknown, I had awakened a strength I never knew existed, and the world around me seemed brighter, more vivid than ever before. I walked back, but now each step was a reminder of the empowerment I found in the face of fear. The ancient woods, with all their shadows and secrets, had led me to the most significant realization of my life, that strength isn't a physical attribute but a mental surge, a determination to rise through challenges. I left the woods that day forever changed, transformed by an experience rooted in both terror and triumph. I entered that cabin a lost soul, but I emerged with clarity, a tangible recognition of my potential. It's easy to dismiss fears as weaknesses, to retreat into our shells, but I now know that each challenge brings us closer to who we are meant to be. So, if you ever find yourself in the woods, lurking near shadows and echoes, remember, it is through the trials we face that we discover our true strengths. The journey is yours to take, embrace it, and you may find yourself soaring beyond your wildest dreams. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am, sitting in my dimly lit living room, the flickering light of my laptop casting strange shadows along the walls. I can hardly believe what happened a few months ago, and I still don't know if I'm more terrified or grateful for the experience that transformed my entire existence. It was a chilly evening when I first noticed the strange advertisement. It was an unassuming flyer, barely fluttering in the wind, plastered on the bulletin board at the corner cafe I frequented. It simply read, "Embrace Change Workshop, Transform Your Life, Limited Seats Available." I laughed it off as yet another gimmick but couldn't shake the feeling that something about it pulled at me. Maybe it was the monotony of my life that had begun to gnaw at me, or perhaps I was just curious. After days of wrestling with my thoughts, I finally decided to call the number printed below. The voice on the other end was smooth and inviting, and I felt an odd sense of comfort as I shared my struggles of feeling trapped in a routine that no longer served me. "You're ready for a change," she said, and I thought about how much I wanted to agree with her, how much I wanted to believe that was true. With a mix of excitement and dread, I signed up for the workshop, not knowing that it would turn my life upside down. The first session took place in a small, dimly lit room filled with mismatched chairs and a faint smell of incense that hung in the air. I remember feeling a tingle of uncertainty as I entered, spotting a group of participants who looked just as lost and desperate for change as I was. The leader, a woman with intense eyes and an almost ethereal presence named Mara, introduced the concept of embracing the unknown. "You have to let the old version of yourself die to give birth to a new one," she proclaimed, and I felt chills spike down my spine, yet I was drawn in. Over the next few weeks, I was subjected to various bizarre exercises. We danced in circles, burned symbolic images of our past, even faced our greatest fears in imaginative scenarios. I started to change in subtle ways. My clothing became brighter, my thoughts less negative, but it all came to a head one fateful evening. Mara announced we would undertake a night walk through the woods behind the center, a journey she claimed would force us to confront our deepest fears. I hesitated but reminded myself that embracing change required courage. As we stepped into the cool embrace of darkness, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The forest beckoned, its shadows whispering secrets long buried. I walked alongside the others, their nervous laughter echoing through the trees. We reached a clearing nestled between the towering oaks, and there Mara instructed us to stand in a circle, holding hands. She told us to close our eyes and envision what we feared most. The silence felt oppressive, thick enough to cut with a knife. As I stood there, eyes shut, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart raced. I felt it, breath on my neck, a presence behind me. Something instinctual within me screamed to open my eyes, but instead, I focused on my fear. A pair of hands grasped my shoulders harshly, and I nearly screamed when Mara's voice cut through the veil of darkness. "What do you see?" I took a breath, forced myself to respond, and in that moment, the floodgates opened. I felt my old insecurities, my fears of inadequacy, the sense that I never belonged, all rise to the surface. "I see a ghost," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mara continued probing, guiding me deeper into this abyss where I confronted my past, failed relationships, lost opportunities, a life unlived. The ghost morphed into familiar faces, people who hurt me or who I felt let me down. Yet as I faced them, I felt something strange rising within me. There was anger, yes, but also a sense of relief. Maybe it was the group's energy, but in that moment, I realized that the past was over. I screamed, releasing everything in a primal way I never knew I needed to. The echo rebounded off the trees, carrying my pain away. When I opened my eyes, the night felt different, everything seemed brighter. The others were looking at me, a mix of sympathy and understanding in their gazes. Mara told us we had crossed over, had changed something fundamental in us. But I didn't quite believe her until something absolutely extraordinary happened on the way back. As we walked, I spotted a flickering light deep within the trees. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, pulling me closer. "What is that?" I muttered, my heart pounding hard against my chest. Mara held me back, her expression serious. "Don't go there. That's not part of the transformation." But my feet seemed to move of their own volition. I felt a compulsion, a calling unlike anything I had experienced, despite Mara's warning lurking at the back of my mind. I stumbled into the clearing, the light intensifying around me, and that's when I saw it, a small, intricately carved mirror hanging from a low branch, glowing with an inner fire. The moment I reached for it, I felt a jolt of energy surge through my body, and the air grew thick and suffocating. I saw reflections that weren't my own, my future selves, branching off into a million possible lives. Each represented a choice I could make, a different path. But with every flicker, I also felt a profound emptiness, a weight of what could never be. I blinked, and the scene shattered around me. Suddenly, everything went dark. Panic surged within me, I couldn't breathe. It felt like I was falling through the void, and just as despair threatened to swallow me whole, I felt hands on me again, steady and sure. It was Mara and the group, pulling me back, reminding me that whatever existed in the mirror was an illusion, a distraction. I felt their strength envelop me, we were in this together. And just like that, I was back in the forest, the mirror fading away. I knew, in that moment, that my transformation wouldn't just be a solitary journey, it was an exploration of what it meant to coexist, to be part of something larger. Somehow embracing change often meant embracing others. That night I returned home, emotions swirling unsteadily within me, but instead of fear or sadness, I felt empowered. I started to rebuild my life actively instead of merely reacting. I reconnected with old friends, explored new activities, and even started a side project I had abandoned long ago. Change didn't happen overnight, but gradually, I noticed the world around me transforming alongside me. My vibrant imaginations of the future became a guiding beacon through mundane days, transforming how I interacted with others, leading me to dive deeper into life, myself, and even the darkness I once feared. But I'll never forget that ghost or the shimmering mirror, and something tells me the transformation is still ongoing. I know there's so much more ahead in this journey of change, but every day I wake up more willing to embrace it, and for that, I am eternally grateful. I may have entered that workshop seeking some scripted guide to transformation, and instead, I found raw truth in change itself, leading me on the adventure of a lifetime, one step, one glance, one terrifying leap into the unknown at a time. When I learned to embrace my uniqueness, a personal story. When I learned to embrace my uniqueness, it wasn't in a triumphant moment of clarity or a well-lit scene in a movie. No, it came slowly, reluctantly, and in layers, like a fog lifting from a field in the early morning light. It was a process marked by uncomfortable, awkward moments that were as humbling as they were revealing. Growing up, I had always felt like the odd one out. While others seemed to move through life with an effortless sense of belonging, I stumbled, trying to mold myself into a shape that just didn't fit. At school, I was the quiet kid who preferred books over sports, who found comfort in stories and imagination rather than in crowds and popularity. I was never bullied, not exactly, but I could feel the subtle isolation, the whispered comments and sidelong glances, the sense that I didn't quite belong. My family loved me, sure, but even there I felt like a bit of an outsider, the creative in a family of pragmatists, the one whose interests and quirks didn't quite line up with their practical ambitions and tidy plans for the future. It wasn't until I left for college that the loneliness of it all started to sink in. Surrounded by new faces, I tried harder than ever to blend in, to be someone who could slip into conversations without a second thought, to say the right things, to wear the right clothes, to adopt the easy laughter and casual confidence I saw in others. I even joined clubs and groups that I thought would make me feel normal, hoping that if I surrounded myself with the right people, I'd somehow absorb their comfort with themselves. But no matter how hard I tried, I still felt like I was faking it, like I was wearing a mask that everyone could see through. Then, in my second year, I met Sophie. She was in one of my literature classes, the kind of person who radiated a quiet confidence that seemed to draw people in without her even trying. She was quirky, unapologetically so, wearing vintage clothes and talking passionately about things most people would dismiss. She didn't just stand out, she stood tall in her uniqueness, unbothered by what anyone thought. One day, we ended up working together on a project, and over time, I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone else. I confessed my struggles, my fears of being different, and my constant feeling of not fitting in. She listened without judgment, her eyes warm and understanding, and then she said something that would stay with me forever: "You're not meant to fit in. You're meant to stand out." At first, I brushed off her words as something people say to make others feel better. But as we spent more time together, I began to notice how Sophie didn't try to hide her quirks, she leaned into them. If she had a strange idea, she shared it. If she had an unusual perspective, she owned it. Watching her, I realized that what made her so magnetic wasn't that she was trying to stand out. She simply didn't hide who she was, and that authenticity made her shine. Her words echoed in my mind for weeks, slowly breaking down the walls of self-doubt I'd spent years building. I started to experiment, testing out small bits of myself that I'd kept hidden for so long. Instead of stifling my love for poetry, I began sharing my favorite lines with friends, even if it felt strange. I started wearing clothes that felt true to me, not just what I thought would help me blend in. I allowed myself to express opinions that I'd usually keep to myself out of fear of seeming too intense or different. At first, it was terrifying. I worried about the stares, the questions, the inevitable judgment. But to my surprise, people started responding positively, not in the way I'd expected, but with genuine interest and curiosity. They wanted to know more, to hear my thoughts, to see the world through my lens. I found myself forming connections with people who valued me for who I truly was, not for the person I'd been pretending to be. There was one moment, though, that truly cemented this newfound acceptance of myself. Our class was holding a small poetry reading, an informal event where students could share their own work or pieces they admired. Sophie urged me to read something I'd written, but the very idea terrified me. The thought of putting my deepest, most personal words out there for others to see felt like baring my soul. But she wouldn't let it go, and finally, I relented. My hands were shaking as I took the small stage, my voice wavering as I began to read. I'd chosen a piece I'd written late one night, a poem about feeling lost, about searching for belonging in a world that seemed determined to ignore me. As I spoke, I expected the usual polite smiles and nods, the lukewarm response of people who didn't quite understand. But as I finished and looked up, I saw faces filled with understanding, with empathy, and something even deeper, a shared vulnerability. When I sat back down, Sophie leaned over, squeezing my hand with a smile that said everything words couldn't. That night, people came up to me, sharing their own stories of feeling out of place, of hiding parts of themselves in a desperate attempt to fit in. It was then that I realized how many of us walk through life wearing masks, hiding the very things that make us unique, that make us human. Over the next few months, I embraced this realization. I stopped worrying about what others thought, stopped trying to mold myself into someone I wasn't. I found myself attracting people who valued authenticity, who were drawn to my unique perspective, my quirks, my passions. It wasn't about being liked by everyone, it was about finding those who saw me and accepted me for who I was. And with each passing day, I felt freer, lighter, more at peace with myself. Embracing my uniqueness didn't mean I became some unshakable pillar of self-confidence overnight. There were still days of doubt, moments when I'd fall back into old habits, but I'd remember Sophie's words, her unwavering belief in being true to oneself. And I'd remind myself that I was enough, that my value wasn't determined by anyone else's approval. Looking back now, I realize how much that journey shaped me, how embracing my uniqueness transformed not just how others saw me, but how I saw myself. I learned to love the parts of me that I'd once tried so hard to hide, the parts that made me who I was. And in doing so, I found a sense of belonging, not in the approval of others, but in the quiet confidence of knowing I was being true to myself. Embracing my uniqueness wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that I'm still on, one that continues to teach me the value of authenticity, of self-acceptance, and of the quiet strength that comes from standing tall in who you are, unafraid and unapologetic. When I tried meditation for the first time, a transformative experience. I had always heard about the benefits of meditation, how it could help clear your mind and bring peace, but I never really believed it. My life was filled with deadlines, work stress, and the usual chaos that came with being an adult. One night, after yet another exhausting day, I found myself scrolling through Reddit in search of something, anything, to help me unwind. That's when I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to meditation. The testimonials were glowing, people claimed it changed their lives. With a hint of skepticism but desperate for relief, I decided to give it a shot. So, I put on some comfortable clothes, dimmed the lights, and found a quiet spot in my small apartment. I had no idea what I was doing but figured I could at least sit still and breathe. I set an alarm for 20 minutes, closed my eyes, and tried to focus on my breath. To be honest, the first few minutes felt awkward and a little ridiculous. I could hear every creak of the floorboards and the distant sounds of the city outside. I kept thinking about work, about that report I hadn't finished, and how I needed to grocery shop tomorrow. It felt like I was trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Every time I grabbed onto a thought, it slipped away like it was never there to begin with. I was about to give up when I suddenly realized there was a deep rumble coming from somewhere around me. It sent a chill down my spine, but also ignited a flicker of curiosity. Tentatively, I tried to incorporate it into my meditation. I focused on the sound, the vibrations enveloping me like a warm blanket. Slowly, it morphed into something else, something almost melodic, and I found myself sinking deeper into the experience. The world around me began to dissolve, as if the walls of my apartment were made of mist. I don't know how long I had been in that space when I felt a presence behind me. My heart raced as I tried to maintain my composure. Was it a ghost? Had I finally gone too far into the realms of meditation? I dared a peek over my shoulder, and the moment I did, everything changed. I was standing in an enormous forest shrouded in a heavy fog. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting into the sky like pleading hands. The hum I had felt earlier pulsed through this place, and for a moment, I felt no fear. Instead, a profound sense of connection washed over me. I stepped forward, my bare feet sinking into the cool, moist earth. As I wandered deeper, the sounds of the city faded completely. There were whispers in the air, a chorus of voices that seemed to be both inviting and warning me at the same time. Just as I thought I understood their murmurs, a figure emerged from the fog. At first glance, they seemed like a woman, though not entirely human. Her skin shimmered with an iridescent hue, and her eyes glowed softly, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. "You've come seeking peace," she said, her voice lilting and echoing. It felt like she was speaking directly into my mind rather than through the air. "But peace has a price." I froze, the gravity of her words sinking in. I had left behind my chaotic life in search of calm, yet here was a being who existed beyond my comprehension, telling me there were consequences to my desires. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, dread pooling at my feet. "Every doorway opened must be walked through, and every meditative state reveals truth." Her gaze pinned me in place. "Do you wish to see?" Against my better judgment, I nodded. In an instant, the forest twisted and warped, colors bleeding into one another. I was shown glimpses of my life, visions of loneliness, of moments where I had hurt others without meaning to, and the shadows of memories buried deep within. I was overwhelmed by sadness, guilt, and a raw vulnerability I had hidden even from myself. I fell to my knees in despair, feeling entirely exposed. "This is the price of peace," she said gently, "the truth lay bare. Only by facing it can you find true tranquility." I felt a weight lift from my chest, but it was soon replaced by a heavier sorrow. "I don't want to feel this," I cried out, my spirit breaking. "I just wanted relief." A soft chuckle echoed around me. "Relief comes in many forms. When you confront that which burdens you, only then can you find balance." In that surreal moment, I realized the truth couldn't simply be pushed away or ignored. I had been living in a fog of my own making, suppressing my emotions, not wanting to deal with the impact of my actions. The trees around me began to glow, illuminating the shadows as if to say there was hope. I took a deep breath and began to understand that the pain I felt could be transformed into something powerful. As I absorbed this revelation, I felt the ground shift beneath me. I was pulled back through the forest, through colorful swirls that twisted and wrapped like ribbons of light until I stumbled back into my living room. My alarm buzzed, jarring me fully awake. I blinked, disoriented but changed. Everything was brighter. The weight I felt earlier did not vanish, but it transformed. It was now a call to action. I picked up a notebook that had been lying on my desk, and I began to write. I wrote about the shadows in my life, about the people I had hurt, the fears I had buried, and the need for forgiveness, not from them, but for myself. As I wrote, I felt lighter, as if I was releasing the tension with each stroke of my pen. The experience of meditation, the being in the forest, the ethereal woman, they all felt like echoes of a truth I was only beginning to unravel. It was the first time I truly understood that peace wasn't just about finding silence, it was about embracing the noise of our existence, confronting and accepting the parts of ourselves that may be hard to face. The next day, I reached out to those I had wronged, starting to mend fences where I thought there were none. I practiced meditation daily, each session unearthing a little more of the chaos within, and every time I faced it, I felt the fog clear just a bit more. I realized meditation wasn't just a practice, it was a journey. One that led me not only to tranquility but also to the strength buried deep within, a transformative experience that went far beyond any simple search for peace. When I faced rejection and surprised myself, I always told myself that I was prepared for rejection, that it was just a part of life. But when the moment came, it hit me like a cold wave of dread, leaving me breathless. It all started at the end of last summer. I was living in my cramped studio apartment, drowning in the noise of the traffic below while my roommate was away. I had just finished my final year of college and was about to apply for my dream job. I had worked tirelessly for the past 4 years, and in my mind, if I put together the right cover letter and resume, there was no way I could fail. As the weeks rolled on, I tirelessly tailored my application, hoping it would grab their attention. But on the day I hit send, that familiar knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. It took nearly a month before I got the email. I was out at the grocery store when I saw it flash across my phone. I didn't even bother to finish checking out. I rushed home, heart racing. When I got to my apartment, I opened the email, and that's when it happened. "We regret to inform you." followed by a series of corporate fluff about how they appreciated my interest but had chosen another candidate. I'd prepared myself for disappointment. I'm not someone who crumbles at rejection. But this felt different. It tore through me. I tossed my phone aside, my stomach in knots, and threw myself onto the couch. I found myself staring at the wall, questioning everything, struggling to breathe. Moments felt like hours as I spiraled deeper into self-doubt. At that moment, all I could think about was how I had invested so much time and energy into something so painfully out of reach. It was like I'd opened a door in my mind to a room filled with all my failures, and I couldn't look away. But then something inside flickered, a rebellious urge, a need to prove that I could rise again. I grabbed a pen and paper, and for the first time, I began to write down my feelings, capturing the hurt, the anger, and ultimately, the determination I felt. I started writing a short story, pouring myself into it, transferring all my fear and disappointment onto the page, like casting a spell to ward off the gloom that threatened to swallow me whole. Day by day, the pages filled up with my pains and triumphs, blending reality with fantasy, creating a world entirely separate from my own. I was lost in the thrill of creation, so engrossed in crafting my story that I lost track of time. It became an incredible escape from the despair that had settled in my heart, my tale morphing into something more potent than mere therapy. This was empowerment. The months slipped by, and with each passing week, I polished and honed my story until it felt complete. It was a surreal experience, like I had resurrected a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing. I decided to share it on a writing platform where other aspiring writers gathered. Heart racing, I posted my work and prepared for immediate feedback. The next couple of weeks were filled with comments, and to my shock, it gained traction. As the days passed, the likes and positive reviews began to skyrocket, winning the hearts of readers who resonated with the themes of rejection and resilience. Comments flooded in, telling me my story connected with them on a level they hadn't anticipated. I couldn't believe the warmth of encouragement pouring through my screen. It felt surreal. People I had never met were telling me how much my words meant to them and how they, too, had faced rejection and fought their way back. And as more readers found my story, something amazing happened. I connected with a community of writers and readers who uplifted each other, supporting one another's artistic journeys. This thriving network motivated me to brush up my skills further. I even began collaborating with other authors and shared workshops to help aspiring writers hone their craft. I felt like a phoenix reborn from the ashes of rejection, and it was exhilarating. Months later, I was surprised to receive a message from a small indie publishing house interested in turning my short story into a full novel. They had discovered my writing through the platform where I had posted. They wanted to know if I was interested in expanding my piece into something larger. It took every ounce of restraint not to scream in disbelief. I found that irony delicious. Rejection had birthed a harvest of creativity that had led to this opportunity. I spent months crafting my manuscript, channeling every ounce of personal struggle and triumph into my writing, and when it was finally published, I felt a surge of accomplishment. I had done it. The cover of my book bore my name, and readers who had once only expressed their support now actually held something of mine in their hands. I chuckled when I thought back to how dismal the future had appeared after receiving that rejection letter. It was a subtle reminder that sometimes, we need to face our shadows, to let them haunt us just a little before we can seize our light and resist the urge to hide. And with that, I had learned that rejection was not a dead-end road but rather a detour, a winding path leading to unforeseen opportunities. I hadn't just faced rejection, I had transformed it, reshaping that pain into fuel for my passion. So if you're ever in a place where the weight of rejection feels unbearable, remember, sometimes, it's only when we confront our sorrows head-on that we surprise ourselves, and perhaps, even find the strength to rewrite our stories. When I finally spoke my truth, I had no idea how dark it would become. It all started innocently enough. A few months ago, I moved back to my tiny hometown after a decade away. I was eager to reconnect with old friends and reclaim a sense of normalcy, maybe even peel back some layers of my forgotten past. I figured it would be a great opportunity to write and share, a purge of emotions I thought long buried. But as I settled back into my old life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I dismissed it as paranoia, a product of a restless mind, but the feeling only intensified each day. Old ghosts seemed to linger, lurking just beyond the periphery of my awareness. My childhood home had always been peculiar. My parents bought it at an auction, and the previous owner was rumored to have disappeared mysteriously. The town whispered about dark rituals and secret gatherings that took place in the basement, a creaky, shadowy place I was drawn to but had never fully explored. One night, as the moon hung heavy and full, casting ghostly shadows across my old bedroom, I felt compelled to descend those stairs. Swallowing my anxiety, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down, my heart racing with each creak of the old wood beneath my feet. The air grew thick and cold, it was an unsettling mix of nostalgia and dread. I entered the basement, and the beam of my flashlight swept over long-forgotten furniture covered in dust. Suddenly, my light landed on a corner where the walls seemed to pulse with darkness, something alive hidden in the shadows. I could feel it staring back at me. Ignoring the voice in my head telling me to run, I approached, my pulse in my ears, and that's when I saw it, a crude symbol etched into the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles that had long since burned out. It pinched at my stomach, and for a brief moment, I felt dizzy. Flashbacks flooded my mind, washed up memories from my childhood, whispers of secrets I had buried deep. I began to remember an unsettling night in high school when a few friends and I had foolishly attempted to summon a spirit for fun. It hadn't gone as planned. The lights flickered as muffled laughter echoed around us. We didn't think much of it then, teenage bravado shielding us from reality. But something then felt wrong. I was jolted back to the present when I noticed a piece of paper half buried in the dust. With bated breath, I picked it up, revealing a list of names scrawled in a jagged, anxious handwriting. At the bottom of the list was mine. I froze. The list was dated years ago, a haunting memento from that foolish night. Panic clenched my throat, and I raced back up the stairs. Over the next few days, unease gripped me tighter. I tried to shake it off, to rationalize the creeping shadows that haunted my days. My experiences bled into my dreams, filled with half-formed faces, laughter, and that damned list taunting me. The irony was suffocating. I wanted to talk, to confess to the lingering dread I felt about that night, but how could I admit that I'd unloosed something dark with my careless words? When I finally confided in a friend, an old acquaintance from school, I felt an instant weight lift. I poured out all my stories, the laughter of our youth, the secrets of the basement, how our childish games might have woken something we didn't understand. Their eyes widened, and it struck me how crazy it sounded. But they didn't laugh. Instead, they leaned in closer, whispering about an old urban legend, one that claimed those who had spoken their truths in that basement had never truly awakened the spirits, merely drawn the attention of something more sinister. A connection clicked in my mind. A week later, I gathered my courage again, returning to the house one last time. I needed to confront whatever I had unleashed. Flashes of the past played out in my mind as I descended again, the darkness wrapping around me like an old friend. With the list clutched tightly in my hand, I stood in the center of the basement, surrounded by the shadows. I was young, I began, my voice trembling, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you. The air thickened with an oppressive silence. I spoke louder, forcing the words out, letting my truth bleed into the darkness. I've learned, and I regret what we did that night. I'm here to set things right. The temperature dropped even further. A flicker of light danced from the corner of my eye, shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't. I felt the heaviness envelop me, the realization that acknowledging my role in that past was only the beginning. Without warning, the basement filled with whispers, echoing my confession until I could hardly think straight. I stumbled back, my breath coming in gasps. It wasn't just echoes of the past, I could feel them, disembodied voices calling out, furious and desperate. I turned to run but tripped and fell to the ground, panic blinding me. Shadows curled around, swirling in a menacing dance as a chill ran down my spine. You spoke, they hissed, a chorus of voices merged into one. And now you must face the consequence. I scrambled to my feet, the whispers clawing at my consciousness, images of my friends, older versions of ourselves, broken by our silence and foolishness. I had opened a door that I couldn't shut, dragging me deeper into a nightmare that played out like a twisted theater of my own regrets. My friends had tried to reach out, they'd been silenced by their own fears. The understanding hit me then, breaking beneath the weight of their collective silence. Those truths had festered long enough, now spilling over, seeking retribution against the one who had finally spoken. I bolted back up the stairs, the shadows lurching behind me, relentless in their pursuit. I burst through the front door, gasping for air, but the voices didn't stop. They clung to my psyche like a poisonous fog. "You opened the door," they taunted, fading into the night. I stumbled into my car, heart racing, desperate to escape the town that had held me prisoner. But even as the engine roared to life, I felt them all around me, an eternal echo of truths spoken and buried. And as I drove away, I realized my confession had not freed me, it had only made me their vessel. I can't go back, even if I tried. The truth I finally spoke has become a chain, binding me to those shadows forever. They whisper at the edge of my mind, reminding me that once you've spoken, there's no shadow that will ever let you go. So if you're ever in your hometown, wherever that may be, beware of the ghosts that lie in wait. The darkness craves to be acknowledged. It feeds on your confessions, and once you give voice to your truth, you might find that it has more to say than you ever intended.